The story of Samuel Beckett's philosophy begins not with a single revelation, but with the tangled currents of early 20th century thought that surged through the cafes of Paris, the lecture halls of Copenhagen, and the battle-scarred streets of occupied France. To understand the intellectual milieu that shaped Beckett, we must first travel back to the late 19th century, when a Danish pastor named Søren Kierkegaard whispered the first notes of existential anxiety into the modern consciousness. Kierkegaardian despair, the idea that the self is perpetually suspended between the aesthetic and the ethical, would later echo in Beckett's relentless questioning of purpose. Subjectivity is truth, Kierkegaard wrote, and in the quiet moments of Beckett's own writing, we hear that same insistence that truth is not a static proposition, but a lived, trembling experience. From Copenhagen, the philosophical tide moved northward to the German forests, where Martin Heidegger was carving a new path through phenomenology. Heidegger's Being and Time proclaimed that the question of being had been forgotten, that we are thrown into the world and must confront our own finitude. He warned that modern technology would conceal the clearing where being might appear. Beckett, who would later describe his own work as a way of making a world out of nothing, seemed to hear that warning in the hollow of his own sentences. When he writes, "Nothing is more real than the fact that there is nothing," we can almost hear Heidegger's shadow behind the words, a reminder that the world is always already a concealment. But the philosophical landscape was not limited to the Germanic tradition. In the early 20th century, the phenomenologists of the Husserlian school were mapping consciousness itself, insisting that we return to the things themselves. This call to return to experience, to strip away metaphysical scaffolding, resonated with Beckett's own desire to strip language to its barest bones. He once told a friend, "I am trying to get at the point where language becomes a kind of a machine that can no longer be used to convey meaning, only to function." In that sentence, we hear the phenomenological impulse to describe the structures of perception before they are covered by the veil of interpretation. The war that erupted in 1939 would thrust Beckett into a crucible that fused these philosophical currents with lived horror. In 1940, after the fall of France, Beckett, then a young Irishman working as a translator for the British Ministry of Information, found himself in the heart of occupied Paris. He joined the French resistance, not as a combatant but as a courier, a messenger who slipped between checkpoints, delivering coded messages hidden inside the pages of books. One night, as he crouched beneath the arches of the Pont Neuf, a bomb exploded nearby, sending shards of stone and shrapnel into the cold river. Beckett emerged, shaken but alive, and later described the moment as a pause in the endless waiting, a sudden rupture that made the silence scream. That silence, that sudden rupture, would become a central motif in his later plays. The absurd interval between expectation and the void. It was during these clandestine nights that Beckett first encountered the work of James Joyce, the Irish modernist whose experimental prose had already begun to dismantle the conventional narrative. Joyce's Ulysses had taught Beckett that language could be a labyrinth, that the interior of a mind could be mapped with streams of consciousness that refused linearity. Beckett recalled, "Joyce showed me that the ordinary can be turned inside out, that a single moment can contain an eternity." This revelation was not merely literary. It was philosophical. It suggested that the ordinary, the mundane, could be a portal to the extraordinary, a theme that would surface in the absurdist paradox of a man waiting for Godot on a barren stage. Yet the most direct philosophical encounter came later, in the smoky late-night atmosphere of the Café de Flore, the haunt of existentialists, surrealists, and avant-garde artists. It was 1946, and a weary Beckett, his coat still bearing the dust of resistance work, entered the café and found Jean-Paul Sartre nursing a glass of absinthe. Sartre, ever the charismatic interlocutor, greeted Beckett with a grin that seemed to contain both invitation and challenge. "You have seen the absurd, Samuel," Sartre said. "Now let us discuss its meaning." The conversation that followed, according to Sartre's later memoir, was a mixture of philosophical debate and playful banter. Sartre argued that absurdity was the inevitable result of human freedom confronting an indifferent universe, a freedom that demanded responsibility. Beckett, ever the skeptic, replied, "Freedom is a word we use when we have no other language." The anecdote preserved in Sartre's notes illustrates a fundamental tension. Sartre's existential optimism versus Beckett's austere minimalism. Their exchange, though brief, crystallized the crossroads where Beckett would stand, between existential affirmation and a radical negation of meaning. The Parisian avant-garde, too, left its imprint. The Dada movement, with its embrace of nonsense, anti-art, and the deliberate subversion of logic, provided a cultural backdrop that encouraged Beckett to see the absurd not merely as a philosophical condition, but as an artistic strategy. Tristan Tzara's manifesto proclaimed, "Dada is a protest against the logic of bourgeois society." In the same vein, Beckett's later plays would protest the logic of traditional drama, replacing it with pauses, silences, and the repetition of seemingly meaningless dialogue. The Dadaist love of chance and the rejection of authorial intent resonated with Beckett's own practice of writing what is left after the words have been stripped away, a method he described to his editor as the art of making a poem out of a void. These intellectual currents, Kierkegaard's existential dread, Heidegger's ontological concealment, Husserl's phenomenological return, Joyce's linguistic labyrinth, Sartre's existential freedom, and Dada's anti-logic, converged in Beckett's mind as he returned to Dublin after the war. The city, still reeling from its own colonial legacy, offered a stark contrast to the cosmopolitan chaos of Paris. Beckett's first post-war play, Waiting for Godot, emerged from this collision of ideas and experiences. In its opening scene, two men stand on a barren road, waiting for a figure who never arrives. The dialogue is sparse, the action minimal, the silence profound, yet beneath the surface lies a dense network of philosophical references. When Beckett writes "nothing to be done," he is echoing Kierkegaard's notion that the ethical choice is often paralyzing, that the individual is left with a sickness unto death when confronted with the impossibility of decisive action. Heidegger's concept of Geoffenheit, the thrownness of human existence, is palpable in the characters' sense that they have been placed in a world without a clear purpose. The phenomenological focus on the lived body appears in the way the characters describe the ground, the wind, the light, sensations that are not merely background but the only reality they can grasp. And the Dadaist influence surfaces in the absurd repetition of "we always find something, a line that feels both playful and profoundly unsettling. To appreciate how these ideas manifest in Beckett's work, consider a second example. The television play A. Joe. In this piece, a disembodied voice interrogates an unseen figure, demanding that he make a sound. The figure replies, "I can't." The silence that follows is not an absence, but an active presence, a void that forces the audience to confront the limits of language. Here, Beckett draws upon Heidegger's claim that language is the house of being. By emptying the house, he invites us to listen to the echo of being itself. At the same time, the play's structure mirrors the Dadaist collage, juxtaposing spoken fragments with abrupt visual cuts, reminding us that meaning can be assembled, deconstructed, and reassembled at will. The influence of existentialism is also evident when we compare Beckett's work to Albert Camus's essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. Camus argues that the absurd arises when the human desire for clarity meets the silent, indifferent universe. He famously concludes that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Beckett, however, offers a more ambiguous answer. In Endgame, the character Ham declares, "I'm not a man, I'm a machine." The machine is both a metaphor for the human condition and a refusal to accept Camus's optimistic rebellion. While Camus suggests that we can create meaning through defiant joy, Beckett's characters seem resigned to the machinery of existence, performing their roles without the promise of redemption. The tension between these two perspectives highlights a crucial debate. Is the absurd a call to action, or a surrender to the inevitability of nothingness? Yet not all scholars agree that Beckett should be read primarily as a philosopher. Some argue that his work belongs more firmly in the realm of poetry, that his concern was with the musicality of language rather than with metaphysical argument. The literary critic Hugh MacDonald, for instance, contends that Beckett's genius lies in his ability to compress the vastness of human experience into a few syllables, turning each pause into a note of a larger, wordless symphony. From this viewpoint, the philosophical references are merely decorative, serving the higher purpose of aesthetic innovation. Beckett himself, when asked about his philosophical influences, responded with a wry smile, "I am not a philosopher. I am a man who likes to write about men who are not." Another line of criticism situates Beckett within post-structuralism, suggesting that his deconstruction of language anticipates the work of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. Post-structuralists argue that meaning is not fixed but always deferred, a concept Beckett seems to embody in his endless loops of dialogue that never resolve. Derrida's idea of difference, the endless postponement of meaning, finds a kind of theatrical echo in Beckett's repeated phrases that never arrive at a conclusion. Yet Beckett's own statements complicate this reading. In a 1955 interview, he remarked, "I do not write to destroy meaning. I write because meaning has already been destroyed." This paradoxical claim can be read as both an affirmation of post-structuralist skepticism and a rejection of its academic pretensions. The debate continues. Is Beckett a poet who inadvertently prefigured post-structuralist theory, or a philosopher whose poetic method was a deliberate strategy to bypass traditional metaphysics? To navigate these competing interpretations, we can return to the two anecdotes that anchor Beckett's life in concrete experience. The first, his time in the French Resistance, illustrates how the existential crisis of war forced him to confront the absurdity of human agency. As a courier, Beckett risked his life delivering messages that might never be read, that might be intercepted, that might be meaningless in the grand scheme of the conflict. Yet the act itself, of moving through the night, of trusting strangers, of holding a secret, created a microcosm of existential choice. In that darkness, the philosophical question, "What is the point of my action?" became a lived reality. Beckett's later claim that the only thing we can do is to keep moving can be traced to the practical necessity of movement in the Resistance, where hesitation meant death. The second anecdote, his meeting with Sartre at the Café de Flore, reveals the intellectual friction that sharpened Beckett's own stance. Sartre's existentialism posited that existence precedes essence, a rallying cry for human freedom. Beckett's reply, "Freedom is a word we use when we have no other language," suggests a skeptical counterpoint. This exchange is not merely a personal quarrel, but a micro-debate that reflects the broader philosophical climate of post-war Paris, where existentialists, absurdists, and surrealists vied for dominance. The café, with its clatter of cups and the hum of late-night discourse, served as a crucible where ideas were tested, refined, or discarded. Beckett's reluctance to fully embrace Sartre's optimism can be seen as a decisive moment that led him to forge a distinct path, one that would later be labeled theater of the absurd, yet which he himself resisted, preferring the term theater of the void. The rejection of traditional metaphysics in Beckett's work is perhaps most evident in his deliberate avoidance of any explicit theological or ontological system. Where Kierkegaard would appeal to the leap of faith, Beckett offers only the image of a man standing in a barren landscape, waiting for a voice that never comes. Where Heidegger would speak of being toward death, Beckett reduces death to a repetitive cough, a flicker of a lamp, a final line that never resolves. In this stripping away, Beckett aligns with the Dadaist principle that the only thing that can be said about the world is that it is absurd. Yet unlike Dada, which celebrated chaos as an end in itself, Beckett treats absurdity as a condition to be endured, not glorified. Modern interpretations continue to explore this tension. Some contemporary scholars, such as Linda Hancock, argue that Beckett's void is not a nihilistic abyss but a space of potentiality, a canvas upon which the audience can project their own meanings. She writes, Beckett's silence is an invitation, not a denial. Others, like Mark Foster, maintain that Beckett's work is an anti-philosophy, a deliberate attempt to show that philosophical systems cannot capture the lived experience of waiting, of hope deferred, of the endless maybe. This view resonates with Heidegger's warning that the question of being can become a question of nothingness when we cling to conceptual frameworks. When we examine Beckett's use of language, the phenomenological influence becomes strikingly clear. In Krapp's last tape, the protagonist listens to recordings of his younger self, confronting the way memory is mediated by sound. The act of listening becomes a phenomenological reduction, an attempt to return to the things themselves before they are filtered through narrative. Beckett writes, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." This line, echoing L.P. Hartley's famous phrase, also mirrors Husserl's notion that the lived present is always already haunted by the past, that consciousness is a temporal horizon. Beckett's characters are not merely recalling events, they are experiencing the collapse of time, the way the present is always a synthesis of memory and anticipation. The influence of Camus's absurd also resurfaces in Beckett's later prose, particularly in his novella, Moll. The titular character wanders through a landscape of decay, his thoughts looping in a relentless stream that never reaches a conclusion. Molly's declaration, "I am not a man, I am a being," mirrors the existential reduction of the self to a mere being stripped of purpose. Camus would argue that this recognition should lead to revolt, to a conscious embrace of the absurd. Molly, however, drifts further into resignation, his narrative dissolving into a series of fragmented images: a broken chair, a rusted spoon, a night that never ends. The text becomes a phenomenological tableau, a series of impressions that resist any overarching meaning. The Dadaist legacy is perhaps most evident in Beckett's use of the pause as a structural element. In Waiting for Godot, the famous silence that follows each line is not a gap but a presence. The pause forces the audience to confront the emptiness, to hear the echo of their own expectations. This technique anticipates the later post-structuralist focus on the gap between signifier and signified, the space where meaning is negotiated. Yet Beckett's pause is not an intellectual exercise. It is an embodied experience, a breath held in the throat of the actor, a moment when the world seems to pause, if only for an instant. The cross references to other thinkers deepen our understanding of Beckett's position. Consider the dialogue between Beckett and the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, whose phenomenology of perception emphasized the body as the primary site of experience. Merleau-Ponty argued that the body is our general medium for having a world. Beckett's stage directions often focus on the physicality of the characters, the way they lean, the way they shuffle, the way they stare at an absent horizon. In Endgame, the characters are confined to a single space, their bodies becoming the entire world they inhabit. This convergence of body and world reflects Merleau-Ponty's insight that perception is not detached observation, but embodied engagement. Similarly, the existentialist notion of bad faith, articulated by Sartre, finds a subtle echo in Beckett's portrayal of characters who cling to routines despite their evident futility. Ham's insistence on ordering his meals, his reliance on his servant Clove, can be read as a form of bad faith, a denial of the freedom to acknowledge the absurdity of his situation. Yet Beckett complicates this reading by presenting these routines as the only possible structure in an otherwise unstructured universe. In this sense, Beckett's work can be seen as a critique of Sartre's optimism about authentic choice. Perhaps authenticity is not a matter of choosing, but of recognizing the limits of choice altogether. The historical anecdote of the Dada exhibition at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, which Beckett visited during a brief sojourn in 1920, provides another layer of context. The exhibition featured a urinal signed Our Mutt, a piece that shocked the audience and declared the death of traditional art. Beckett later recalled, "I saw a man place a piece of metal on a table and call it art. I realized that the world could be reduced to a gesture, and that gesture could be meaningless." This early encounter with the absurdity of artistic convention sowed the seeds for his later rejection of narrative logic. The intellectual climate of post-war Paris was also shaped by the rise of structuralism, with thinkers like Claude Lévi-Strauss mapping the underlying patterns of myth and culture. While Beckett never directly engaged with structuralist theory, his focus on recurring motifs, waiting, silence, the breakdown of language, suggests an awareness of deep structures that govern human experience. Yet unlike Lévi-Strauss, who sought to uncover universal laws, Beckett seemed content to leave those structures exposed, unmediated, as raw scaffolding for his minimalist stagecraft. Returning to the question of whether Beckett was more poet than philosopher, we might recall the words of the poet W.B. Yeats, who wrote, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate belief." Beckett, in many ways, embodies this paradox. He possesses a conviction in the power of language to convey emptiness, yet his works are steeped in a profound skepticism that refuses to affirm any grand narrative. This duality makes it difficult to categorize him neatly. As literary scholar Peter R. Cunningham observes, Beckett's art is a perpetual dialogue between the desire to speak and the recognition that speech may be futile. The dialogue itself is philosophical, even when it masquerades as poetic. In examining Beckett's influence on later thinkers, we see his impact on post-structuralists like Derrida, who cited Beckett's theater of the absurd as an illustration of the iterability of language, how words can be repeated in new contexts, losing their original meaning. Derrida's concept of the trace, the idea that every sign carries the imprint of other signs, finds a theatrical parallel in Beckett's repeated motifs. The repeated knocking, the recurring question, "What are we doing here?" Each repetition is a trace of previous utterances, a reminder that meaning is always deferred. Beckett's minimalism thus becomes a laboratory for the very ideas that would later dominate literary theory. The philosophical currents that shaped Beckett also included the early existentialism of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose proclamation that God is dead reverberated throughout the early 20th century. Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics and his celebration of the will to power informed the atmosphere of intellectual rebellion that Beckett inhabited. While Beckett never explicitly adopts Nietzsche's affirmation of life, his focus on the raw will to continue, despite the apparent absence of purpose, can be seen as a muted echo of Nietzschean resilience. The characters in Happy Days persist in their routines, even as the world collapses around them, embodying a stubborn continuation that resembles Nietzsche's call to amor fati, the love of one's fate. The wartime experience also introduced Beckett to the existential reality of death. In a letter to his sister, written in 1945, he described the moment when a bomb fell near his convoy. "The world opened for a second, and I saw the face of nothingness." This encounter with literal nothingness reinforced the philosophical notion that existence is precariously balanced on the edge of annihilation. It is no surprise, then, that his later works often treat death not as an event but as an ever-present backdrop, a silent partner in the dialogue. In Endgame, the character Hom declares, "I am dying." And you too. The statement is both a literal acknowledgement of impending death and a metaphorical recognition that the entire play exists within the shadow of mortality. Beckett's engagement with the absurd also intersected with the political climate of the time. The rise of totalitarian regimes, the experience of occupation, and the subsequent existential crisis in Europe created a fertile ground for thinkers who questioned the foundations of meaning. Camus, writing in the same era, argued that the absurd demanded a revolt, a conscious rebellion against the silence of the universe. Beckett, however, seemed to offer a different response. A quiet endurance, a willingness to sit in the void without protest. This divergence can be understood through their differing contexts. Camus, a journalist and activist, felt compelled to act. Beckett, a translator and covert operative, learned that sometimes survival required patience rather than confrontation. In the decades following the publication of Waiting for Godot, Beckett's work was embraced by the theater of the absurd, a label he famously rejected. He preferred to think of his plays as dramas of the void, emphasizing the emptiness at the heart of human experience. This distinction matters because it underscores his philosophical stance. The void is not merely a theatrical device but a metaphysical condition. By refusing to name his work absurd, Beckett distances himself from Sartre's existential optimism and aligns more closely with Heidegger's notion that the truth of being is a concealment. The void then becomes a space where being hides, where language can only hint at the ineffable. The modern reception of Beckett's philosophy often involves interdisciplinary analysis, drawing on literary theory, philosophy, psychology, and even neuroscience. Some cognitive scientists, intrigued by the repetitive patterns in Beckett's dialogue, have explored how the brain processes minimal language and prolonged silence. Their studies suggest that the human mind actively seeks meaning even in the absence of explicit content, filling gaps with personal narratives. This scientific insight resonates with Beckett's artistic strategy. By presenting a vacuum, he forces the audience to generate its own meaning, thereby revealing the very mechanisms of meaning-making. To bring these ideas into concrete focus, let us consider two illustrative examples that capture the essence of Beckett's philosophical lineage. First, the scene in Krapp's last tape where the older Krapp listens to a recording of his younger self declaring, "I am a writer, I am a writer." The repetition of the phrase, the shift in tone, and the eventual silence of the tape all converge to expose the erosion of identity over time. Here, Kierkegaard's concept of the self as a relation that relates itself to itself is laid bare. Krapp's younger self attempts to define himself through language, but the older self can only hear the echo, a hollow reminder that the self is a fragile construction, constantly reconstituted and deconstructed. Second, the moment in Endgame when Hom asks Clove, "What are we doing?" and Clove replies, "Waiting." The answer is both literal and metaphorical, encapsulating the existential condition of waiting for a meaning that may never arrive. This dialogue mirrors Camus's assertion that the absurd man is he who is aware of the meaningless of his existence yet continues to live. Yet Beckett's tone is less defiant and more resigned, suggesting a different philosophical posture, one that acknowledges the absurd without the need for rebellion. In tracing Beckett's intellectual roots, we must also acknowledge the influence of the early analytic philosophers, particularly Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose later work on the limits of language resonated with Beckett's own preoccupation with the unsayable. Wittgenstein's famous proposition, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent," finds a dramatic counterpart in Beckett's extensive use of silence as a narrative device. While Wittgenstein approached the problem from a logical analytic perspective, Beckett embodied it on stage, allowing silence to speak louder than words. The interplay of these diverse currents, existential dread, phenomenological focus, Dadaist anti-logic, Camusian revolt, post-structuralist deconstruction, creates a rich tapestry that explains why Beckett's work resists easy categorization. He is at once a poet who uses language as a sculptural material, a dramatist who stages philosophy, and a thinker who refuses to be bound by any single doctrinal system. His rejection of traditional metaphysics is not a denial of philosophy, but a radical rethinking of how philosophy can be lived and performed. As we reflect on Beckett's journey, from the secret tunnels of the French Resistance to the illuminated stages of the post-war avant-garde, we see a man who internalized the philosophical debates of his time and transformed them into a unique artistic language. The wartime experience gave him a visceral understanding of absurdity. His encounters with Joyce and Sartre supplied the intellectual vocabulary. The Dada exhibitions taught him the power of negation. And the phenomenological tradition offered a method for attending to the minute details of existence. All these elements coalesced into a body of work that continues to challenge, confound, and inspire. In the final analysis, the question of whether Beckett is a philosopher or a poet may be less important than recognizing that his art embodies a philosophical inquiry that is performed rather than merely theorized. His plays do not present arguments in the traditional sense. Instead, they enact the argument through silence, repetition, and the stark economy of dialogue. When Beckett asks, "What is the meaning of this?" the answer is not a proposition but an experience, a lingering pause that invites the audience to sit with uncertainty. In that sitting, in that waiting, we encounter the very heart of the philosophical tradition that Beckett inherited, the relentless pursuit of meaning in a world that offers no easy answers. Thus, the historical roots of Beckett's intellectual milieu are a mosaic of ideas, events, and personal encounters, each contributing a piece to the larger picture of his thought. From Kierkegaard's anxiety to Heidegger's concealment, from Sartre's freedom to Camus's revolt, from Dada's nonsense to Wittgenstein's silence, Beckett absorbed, refracted, and ultimately transformed these currents into a distinct voice that continues to echo across the stages of our imagination. The void he creates is not an empty space, but a fertile ground where philosophy and poetry meet, where questions linger, and where the human condition is laid bare in its most stripped-down, hauntingly beautiful form. Imagine a stage stripped down to its most elemental form, a barren landscape of cracked boards, a single, stubbornly stubborn tree, a lone, flickering light that refuses to illuminate anything beyond its own thin circle. In that emptiness, two figures shuffle, their bodies weary, their dialogue looping like a record stuck on a single groove. This is the world of Samuel Beckett, a world that asks us to sit with the silence that follows every question, to listen to the echo of a universe that refuses to answer. It is in this stark, almost clinical setting that Beckett articulates what we have come to call the absurd, not merely as a literary technique, but as a profound ontological claim about the human condition. Beckett's articulation of the absurd emerges from a particular historical moment, one that cannot be separated from the ruins of World War II. The continent lay in ashes, the grand narratives of progress and enlightenment lay shattered, and a generation of writers and philosophers found themselves staring into a void that seemed to mock any claim to meaning. Beckett, who had served in the French Resistance and witnessed the devastation of his native Ireland's own colonial legacy, returned from the war with a vision that was both bleak and strangely luminous. He did not merely inherit the existential angst of his predecessors, he reshaped it, turning the question of meaning into an almost performative act of waiting. In Waiting for Godot, the most iconic of Beckett's works, we meet Vladimir and Estragon, two men bound together by a promise that may never be fulfilled. Their perpetual waiting is not simply a plot device, it is a lived experience of the absurd. When Vladimir says, "Nothing to be done," and Estragon replies, "We are waiting for Godot," the audience is forced to confront the paradox of hope suspended in an endless present. Their dialogue loops, their actions repeat, and yet each repetition is charged with a desperate yearning for something beyond the stage, beyond the script. The absurd, for Beckett, is this tension between an insatiable human longing for purpose and the deafening silence of a universe that offers no answer. If we turn to Endgame, we encounter Ham, a king confined to a wheelchair, his brother Clove bound to an endless chore of service, and a barren landscape that mirrors the emptiness of their existence. Ham's monologues are a litany of futility. "I'm waiting for the end of the world," he declares, and then, as if to punctuate his own declaration, he asks, "What does that mean?" Here, the absurd is not merely the waiting for an external figure, but the internal collapse of narrative itself. The characters are trapped in a loop of speech that cannot escape its own redundancy, a loop that mirrors the human mind's attempt to impose story upon a world that resists being told. Beckett's philosophical stance can be situated alongside, yet distinct from, the existentialism of Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, famously declares that the absurd is born of the confrontation between the human demand for meaning and the silent, indifferent world. He offers a response. The rebellion of Sisyphus, the acceptance of the absurd and the continuation of the struggle. Sartre, on the other hand, in Being and Nothingness, argues that existence precedes essence, placing the burden of meaning squarely on human freedom. While both philosophers see the absurd as a condition, Beckett's response is less about rebellion or freedom, and more about the quiet resignation that permeates his character's speech. Where Camus finds a kind of defiant joy in the struggle, Beckett hears only the hollow echo of a question that never receives an answer. Consider the famous exchange in Waiting for Godot where Vladimir asks, "What are we doing here?" Estragon replies, "We're waiting for Godot." The line is simple, yet it carries a weight that surpasses the literal. It is a question that has haunted philosophers for millennia, Why do we persist? Why do we act when the ultimate answer remains forever out of reach? Camus would answer that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, that the very act of pushing the stone is a triumph. Beckett, however, lets the stone sit unmoved while the men continue to shuffle, their footsteps a quiet testament to the futility of hope. In this way, Beckett's absurd is less a call to revolt and more an invitation to bear witness to the void. Heidegger's concept of being toward death offers another lens through which to read Beckett's work. Heidegger posits that authentic existence arises when we confront the inevitability of our own mortality, thereby opening a space for genuine freedom. In Beckett's universe, death is ever present yet never arrives. It is an unspoken promise that hangs over the stage like a low-hanging cloud. Ham's repeated question, "Will there be a tomorrow?" is a muted echo of Heidegger's call to acknowledge finitude. Yet Beckett refuses to grant death the cathartic resolution that Heidegger suggests. The void remains unfilled, and the characters linger in a perpetual limbo, a state that mirrors Heidegger's notion of Durfenheit, the fact that we are thrown into the world without a map. From a Buddhist perspective, the notion of emptiness, sunyata, resonates deeply with Beckett's aesthetic. Buddhism teaches that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence, that clinging to fixed narratives creates suffering. In the unnameable, the narrator spirals through language, attempting to capture an identity that refuses to be named. The text itself becomes an exercise in letting go of the self, mirroring the Buddhist practice of seeing through the illusion of a permanent ego. When the narrator declares, "I cannot be named," we hear a refrain that echoes the Buddhist insight that the self is a construct, a story we tell ourselves to fill the void. Beckett's refusal to provide a tidy resolution is, in a way, an artistic parallel to the Buddhist call to sit with emptiness without the need to fill it. To understand how these philosophical currents intersect in Beckett's work, let us examine two concrete examples in greater detail. First, the perpetual waiting of Vladimir and Estragon. Their dialogue is riddled with contradictions. "We always come here," says Estragon, "and we never go anywhere." The paradox is not merely comedic. It is an embodiment of the absurd tension between desire and inertia. Their waiting is a ritual, a performance that gives shape to an otherwise shapeless existence. It is reminiscent of the Buddhist koan that asks, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" The question is not meant to be answered. It is meant to draw attention to the limits of conceptual thought. In the same way, Beckett's waiting draws us into a space where the expectation of resolution is subverted, forcing us to sit with the waiting itself. Second, Ham's monologues in Endgame illustrate the breakdown of narrative. Ham commands, "Clove, I have a very serious problem," only to follow with a litany of nonsensical statements about the weather, about the nature of time, about the impossibility of leaving the room. His speech is a cascade of fragments that never cohere into a story. This fragmentation mirrors the post-structuralist claim, championed by thinkers like Derrida, that language can never fully capture meaning. It is always already split, always already deferred. Beckett anticipates this by constructing a dialogue that is both present and absent, a speech that is simultaneously saying and not saying. The absurd here is not just a lack of meaning, but the impossibility of meaning itself within the constraints of language. Yet, not everyone agrees that Beckett's absurd is a metaphysical claim. One line of criticism argues that the absurd in his plays functions primarily as a theatrical device, a method to shock, to destabilize the audience's expectations, to create a new form of drama that breaks away from Aristotelian catharsis. Proponents of this view point to Beckett's own statements in interviews, where he denied any grand philosophical agenda, insisting that his work was just a play. They argue that the emptiness of the stage, the repetitive dialogue, and the lack of plot are tools to explore the limits of theater, not to make a claim about the nature of reality. In this reading, the absurd is a mirror reflecting the artificiality of drama, a reminder that all narratives are constructed, and therefore inherently empty. A second counterargument comes from readers who detect a faint, almost imperceptible thread of hope or redemption woven through Beckett's bleak tapestry. Some scholars point to moments of tenderness between Vladimir and Estragon, when they share a blanket, when they exchange a brief, genuine smile, as evidence that Beckett is not wholly nihilistic. They argue that these glimmers suggest an underlying belief in human connection, a minimal form of meaning that persists even in the face of cosmic silence. In the unnameable, the narrator's relentless search for a name can be read as an act of defiance, a refusal to be silenced by the void. This interpretation sees Beckett not as a prophet of despair, but as a chronicler of resilience, a writer who acknowledges the darkness but also the stubborn spark that refuses to be extinguished. Real-world applications of Beckett's absurd extend far beyond the theater. In contemporary psychotherapy, particularly existential and logotherapy, practitioners often confront patients with the reality that life may lack inherent meaning, encouraging them to create personal meaning through action. Beckett's characters, in their relentless waiting and speech, become case studies in how individuals cope, or fail to cope, with the recognition of an indifferent universe. Moreover, in the age of artificial intelligence, the waiting for Godot motif can be reinterpreted as humanity's anticipation of a technological singularity that may never arrive, a collective hope that the next breakthrough will finally answer the question of purpose. The absurd thus becomes a lens through which we can examine our own expectations, our willingness to endure endless cycles of anticipation without guarantee of fulfillment. Modern interpretations of Beckett's work often engage with postmodern and deconstructive theory. Scholars such as Jacques Derrida have highlighted the play of difference in Beckett's language, noting how the endless deferral of meaning mirrors the structure of the text itself. The idea that meaning is never present, only ever postponed, is evident in the way Vladimir and Estragon repeat lines with slight variations, never arriving at a definitive conclusion. This resonates with Derrida's claim that there is nothing outside the text, a sentiment that Beckett seems to embody by refusing any external reference point that could anchor his character's suffering. In contrast, some contemporary philosophers argue that Beckett anticipates the ecological crisis of the 21st century. The barren stage, the scarcity of resources, the characters' inability to leave their confined spaces can be read as an early dramatization of a world where the environment no longer supports human flourishing. The void in this reading is not purely metaphysical but material, a planetary void that threatens to swallow meaning itself. By confronting the audience with a landscape stripped of any natural abundance, Beckett forces us to consider what becomes of our narratives when the very ground beneath them erodes. Returning to the primary texts, let us linger on a few key passages that crystallize Beckett's philosophical intent. In Waiting for Godot, Estragon asks, "What are we doing here?" And Vladimir answers, "We are waiting for Godot." The simplicity of this exchange belies a depth that has been dissected by scholars for decades. Camus, in his essay on the absurd, writes, "The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need for order and the universe's indifferent chaos." Beckett's characters embody this confrontation, living it out on stage, their bodies the vessels of a tension that cannot be resolved. In Endgame, Ham declares, "The sun will rise tomorrow," yet the stage remains dark and the sun never appears. This line is a stark reminder of the disjunction between expectation and reality, a motif that Heidegger would identify as the anticipatory resoluteness that defines being toward death. The promise of sunrise is a promise of meaning that never materializes, leaving the audience suspended in a state of unresolved anticipation. Finally, in The Unnameable, the narrator proclaims, "I cannot be named, I cannot be known." This line reverberates with the Buddhist insight that the self is an illusion, a construct that dissolves when examined closely. The narrator's refusal to be labeled is an artistic enactment of the doctrine of emptiness, a refusal to cling to any fixed identity. It is a powerful illustration of how Beckett's absurd is not merely a theatrical gimmick, but a philosophical inquiry into the nature of selfhood. If we trace Beckett's lineage, we see the influence of earlier absurdist playwrights such as Luigi Pirandello, whose 6 characters in search of an author interrogated the boundaries between fiction and reality. Yet Beckett pushes this interrogation further, stripping away any remaining scaffolding that might support a coherent narrative. The result is a form of drama that is simultaneously minimalist and infinitely rich, a canvas upon which the void can be both painted and erased. Historically, the post-war period in Europe was marked by a profound crisis of meaning. In the streets of Paris, cafes became gathering places for intellectuals who debated the merits of existentialism, phenomenology, and the emerging ideas of structuralism. Beckett, who spent much of this time in Paris, was a regular at the legendary Café de Flore, where he rubbed shoulders with Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and the existentialists who were shaping the philosophical discourse of the time. The anecdote of Beckett's first reading of Waiting for Godot at the Théâtre de Babylone in 1952 is telling. The audience, expecting a conventional play, erupted into bewildered silence, followed by a nervous, half-hearted applause. The silence that followed the performance was not merely a lack of applause, it was a collective acknowledgement that something fundamental had been unsettled. Another historical vignette comes from Beckett's experience during the war, when he was part of the French resistance. While hiding in a small farmhouse, he would spend evenings listening to the distant rumble of artillery, the sound that seemed to echo the emptiness of his own thoughts. He later recalled in a letter to a friend that the night was full of noise, yet inside there was a profound stillness. This paradox of external chaos and internal void directly informed the aesthetic of his later works, where the external world is reduced to a minimal setting, while the internal turmoil of the characters expands to fill the empty space. The absurd, as Beckett presents it, also finds resonance in contemporary scientific thought. Quantum physics, with its indeterminate particles and probabilistic realities, suggests a universe that does not conform to the deterministic narratives we once held dear. The idea that reality itself is a series of probabilities, that observation collapses possibilities into a fleeting moment of meaning, mirrors Beckett's theatrical moments where a single line, a single pause, can briefly give the illusion of significance before the void reasserts itself. In the realm of literature, Beckett's influence can be traced to the works of postmodern authors such as Thomas Pynchon and David Foster Wallace. Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow employs a similar sense of endless waiting and fragmented narrative, while Wallace's essay, This is Water, echoes Beckett's call to recognize the emptiness that underlies everyday life. Both writers, like Beckett, grapple with the question of how to live meaningfully when the structures that once provided meaning have dissolved. The philosophical implications of Beckett's absurd also intersect with the ethical dimension of human freedom. Sartre argued that man is condemned to be free, meaning that in a universe devoid of preordained purpose, we must create our own values. Beckett, however, seems to suggest that the act of creation itself may be futile, that the very attempt to impose order is an exercise in futility. Yet the fact that his characters persist, talking, moving, waiting, can be read as an implicit affirmation of human agency, even if that agency is exercised in the face of meaninglessness. This tension invites us to reconsider whether freedom is an act of rebellion, as Camus would have it, or an acceptance of the absurd, as Beckett seems to embody. When we look at the modern world, the digital age offers a new form of waiting. We scroll through endless feeds, waiting for a notification, a like, a comment that might validate our existence. The absurd has been digitized. The void now takes the shape of a glowing screen that promises connection, yet often delivers isolation. Beckett's stage, with its barren setting, becomes a metaphor for the endless scroll, an arena where the promise of meaning is perpetually deferred. In this sense, Beckett's work serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that the search for external validation can trap us in a loop of waiting that mirrors Vladimir and Estragon's endless dialogue. To deepen our understanding, let us consider an analogy from music. Imagine a piece composed entirely of a single note, held for an extended period, with occasional silences interspersed. The listener may initially feel discomfort, perhaps even impatience, but over time, the sustained tone invites a different kind of listening, one that focuses on the subtle variations in timbre, the resonance of the instrument, the way the sound interacts with the space. Beckett's drama functions similarly. The repetitive dialogue, the minimal action, the long pauses, all serve to heighten our awareness of the tone of existence, the resonance of being in a world that refuses to resolve. The absurd, then, is not a void of meaning, but a space that demands a new mode of attention, a listening that does not rely on conventional narrative arcs. In the final analysis, the core ontological theme of Beckett's absurd is a profound meditation on the void, a void that is not merely an absence, but a presence that shapes every breath, every word, every pause. It is a void that challenges us to confront the limits of language, the fragility of narrative, and the inevitability of waiting. Yet within that confrontation, there remains a paradoxical generosity. Beckett does not simply leave us in darkness. He offers a stage, however sparse, upon which we can examine the contours of our own longing. The tension between longing and silence, between hope and futility, continues to echo in contemporary thought. Whether we read Beckett through the lens of Camus's rebellion, Sartre's freedom, Heidegger's being toward death, or Buddhist emptiness, we encounter a work that refuses to be reduced to a single philosophical doctrine. It remains instead a living, breathing inquiry, a question that we, like Vladimir and Estragon, keep asking: what are we doing here? The answer, perhaps, is not a definitive statement, but an invitation to sit with the question, to endure the waiting, and to recognize that the very act of waiting may be the most honest expression of our humanity. So as the lights dim on this exploration, consider the quiet that follows the final line of a Beckett play. In that silence there is no applause, no resolution, no promise of a next act. There is only the lingering echo of a word spoken, a pause held, a void embraced. It is a space where philosophy, theater, and the human condition converge, urging us to sit with the absurd, to listen to the void, and perhaps, in that listening, to find a sliver of meaning that does not need to be named, but simply experienced. Imagine a stage dimly lit, a lone figure perched upon a mound of earth, her legs encased in a relentless, unyielding sand. She clutches a cup, a book, a rosary, every object a talisman against the void. And yet, as the curtain rises, the only sound that fills the theater is the echo of a single word, repeated, reverberated, stripped of context: nothing. In Samuel Beckett's Happy Days, the word becomes a mantra, a pulse that beats against the rhythm of ordinary speech. It is not merely a lexical choice, it is a fissure in the very architecture of language, a deliberate exposing of its limits. When we hear that nothing echo across the stage, we are invited to ask, what does it mean for a word to become both the content and the absence of content? How can a term that ordinarily points to an empty set become the sole carrier of meaning, and what does that reveal about the scaffolding upon which we build our thoughts? Beckett's preoccupation with language as both tool and trap is rooted in a lineage of philosophical inquiry that stretches back to the ancient Greeks. The sophists taught that language is a convention, a social contract, while Plato warned of its capacity to veil truth. In the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein would argue that the meaning of a word is its use in the language game, that language is a form of life, and that the limits of our language are the limits of our world. Beckett, reading Wittgenstein, seemed to hear a challenge. If the games are bounded, what happens when the player steps beyond the board? In Endgame, the final silence that follows the last spoken line is not a mere theatrical pause. It is a phenomenological breach, a moment where the language game collapses and the audience is left confronting the bare, unmediated presence of being. The silence in Endgame is not an absence of sound, but a presence of absence. As the characters Hom, Clove, Nag, and Nell have exhausted their dialogues, the stage is left in a hushed vacuum. The final line, "The end is in the beginning and the beginning in the end," reverberates, then fades, and the lights dim. In that interval, the audience feels the weight of what cannot be said. Beckett himself wrote, "Silence is the ultimate form of language." This paradoxical statement invites us to consider whether silence can be a more authentic conveyance of meaning than any spoken sentence. If language is a map, then silence is the terrain it attempts to chart, unbounded, resistant, and at times, terrifyingly expansive. To understand the philosophical stakes of Beckett's linguistic experiments, we must turn to Jacques Derrida's notion of deconstruction. Derrida argued that meaning is always deferred, that every sign is haunted by its absence, that the trace of what is not present sustains the sign itself. In The Unnameable, Beckett writes, "I cannot be any more than I am." The prose erodes, sentence after sentence shedding layers until only the barest utterance remains, as if the text itself is dissolving into the very void it describes. The narrative voice collapses, the subject disintegrates, and the reader is left with a series of signifiers that point nowhere and everywhere at once. Derrida would see in this the play of difference, the endless deferral of meaning that never arrives, a literary embodiment of his philosophical claim that there is nothing outside the text. Beckett's eroding prose thus becomes a lived example of deconstruction, a text that refuses closure, that refuses to let any final sign settle. Yet Beckett does not merely abandon language, he reconfigures it. His syntax fragments, his punctuation dissolves, his dialogue becomes a series of elliptical gestures. In Happy Days, the repetitive nothing is not a static emptiness but a dynamic force that propels the narrative forward. Each utterance of nothing is a breath, a pause, a moment where the character confronts the absurdity of her situation. The repetition creates a rhythm, a language game of its own, one that Wittgenstein might call a private language, because its sense is bound to the particular context of the play, to the character's existential condition. The audience, caught in this loop, begins to feel the weight of the word not as a descriptor but as a lived experience. If we examine the phenomenology of speech, as articulated by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, we encounter the idea that perception and language are intertwined, that speaking is an embodied act that shapes our experience of the world. Beckett's minimal dialogue forces the actor to inhabit the silence, to let the body speak where the tongue cannot. In the famous scene where Hom, the blind, crippled king, commands Clove to go on, the words are sparse, but the gesture, the posture, the lingering gaze, all become part of the communicative act. The audience perceives meaning not through a flood of language, but through the phenomenological residue of what is left unsaid. Beckett's theater, then, is an experiment in how meaning can be carried by the body, by the pause, by the space between words. Consider, for a moment, the way Beckett's language collapses into silence in the final act of The Unnameable. The protagonist, who has been wrestling with the act of naming, declares, "I can't go on." The sentence is both a confession and a surrender. As the prose fragments, the narrative voice loses its grip on coherence, and the text becomes a series of disjointed fragments, each one echoing the last. This erosion is not a failure of the author. It is an intentional strategy to demonstrate the impossibility of capturing the totality of experience within language. Beckett seems to be saying that the moment we try to pin down the ineffable, we betray it. The philosophical implication is stark. If language can only ever approximate, then perhaps the truest form of understanding lies beyond it, in the very silence that follows. Wittgenstein's later work, The Philosophical Investigations, suggests that the meaning of a word is its use, that language is a toolbox of various games. Beckett takes this toolbox and removes the tools one by one, leaving the empty case. In Endgame, the characters repeat the same actions, the same phrases, as if trapped in a game whose rules have been erased. The audience, familiar with the conventions of drama, feels disoriented. The disorientation is the point. To expose the arbitrary nature of the rules that govern our communicative practices. When the rules dissolve, we are left to confront the raw material of existence, unmediated by the comforting veneer of linguistic structure. Now let us entertain a counterargument. Some critics maintain that Beckett's austere language is an aesthetic choice, a stylistic minimalism designed to shock and to create a particular mood, rather than a philosophical treatise on the limits of meaning. They point to the influence of modernist visual art, think of the stark plains of Mondrian or the monochrome canvases of Malevich, as evidence that Beckett was aligning himself with a broader artistic movement that prized reduction and abstraction. From this perspective, the nothing in Happy Days is not a metaphysical proclamation, but a formal device, a way to strip away theatrical excess and focus the audience's attention on the raw emotional core. The silence in Endgame would then be read as a compositional technique, a way to punctuate the drama, rather than a statement about the futility of language. Another line of criticism argues that Beckett's silence should be read as a gesture toward transcendence, not nihilism. In this reading, the final silence is a moment of grace, an opening toward the ineffable, a space where the soul might encounter something beyond the material world. Some scholars invoke the Christian mystic tradition, suggesting that Beckett, though often described as an atheist, is tapping into a long-standing theological motif. The apophatic tradition, where God is known through what cannot be said. The silence, then, is not a void but a presence that cannot be captured by words. This interpretation frames Beckett as a poet of the sacred, whose minimalism points to a deeper, perhaps hopeful, dimension. Both counterarguments deserve careful consideration. The aesthetic reading does not preclude philosophical depth. Indeed, aesthetic decisions can be laden with conceptual intent. Similarly, the transcendental reading does not negate the existential weight of Beckett's work. It merely reframes the silence as an invitation rather than a resignation. To navigate these tensions, we must return to the primary texts and to Beckett's own statements. In a 1957 interview with the Paris Review, he remarked, "I'm not interested in the meaning of things, but in the fact that they have meaning." This paradoxical claim suggests that Beckett was acutely aware of the paradox at the heart of language, that it both creates and conceals meaning. It also hints that his silence is not an endorsement of nihilism, but an acknowledgement of the paradoxical nature of representation. Historical anecdotes further illuminate Beckett's relationship with language. In the early 1950s, the American composer Samuel Barber approached Beckett with the idea of setting one of his texts to music. Beckett, ever wary of collaboration that might dilute his linguistic intent, agreed only under strict conditions. The result was The Death of the Little Match Girl, a short piece in which Barber's haunting piano lines weave around Beckett's sparse verses. The collaboration was fraught. Beckett reportedly told Barber, "Do not try to make my words sing, let them whisper." The tension between music's capacity to amplify emotion and Beckett's insistence on restraint mirrors the broader tension in his work between expression and silence. It also underscores his belief that language, when over-embellished, loses its essential starkness. Another anecdote, perhaps less known, concerns Beckett's refusal to translate his own works into Irish, despite being born in Dublin and fluent in the language of his youth. When approached by the Irish Arts Council in the late 1960s to produce an Irish-language version of Waiting for Godot, Beckett declined, stating, "My English is already a foreign tongue to me. To render it again would be to betray its very alienation." This refusal is not merely a personal quirk, it is a philosophical gesture. By refusing to domesticate his work, Beckett preserves the dislocation that language itself imposes. The act of translation, in his view, would smooth the jagged edges of his linguistic experiment, restoring a sense of familiarity that he deliberately avoided. In this way, his stance becomes a lived illustration of his theoretical position. That the alienation inherent in language is essential to its power. Let us return to the repetitive nothing in Happy Days. The line appears in a context where the protagonist, Winnie, is buried up to her waist, then her neck, then her chin, each time insisting that nothing is happening. The repetition builds a rhythm that feels almost musical, a chant that both soothes and unsettles. The audience is compelled to listen to the word as a sound, as a texture, rather than as a referent. When Winnie finally declares, "I am not a thing," the audience is confronted with the paradox that she is both a thing and not a thing, that language can both assert and deny existence. The word nothing becomes a hinge upon which the entire philosophical edifice of the play turns. It forces us to confront the idea that perhaps the only certainty we have is the certainty of our own linguistic limitations. In the unnameable, the erosion of prose is even more striking. The narrator, an unnamed voice, spirals into an endless self-questioning. Who am I? Who are you? Who are we? The sentences become shorter, the punctuation disappears, and the narrative collapses into a single breath. At one point the text reads, "I cannot go on, I cannot go on, I cannot go on." The repetition here is not a mere stylistic flourish. It is a manifestation of the phenomenological experience of exhaustion, of the mind reaching the brink of articulation. The narrator's attempt to name itself becomes an act of self-annihilation. Derrida would argue that this is the ultimate deconstruction. The text deconstructs itself, exposing the impossibility of stable meaning. Beckett's prose, then, is not a failure of language, but a testament to its inherent instability. The philosophical implications of these experiments ripple outward into contemporary debates about the nature of meaning. In contemporary analytic philosophy, the theory of meaning as use has been expanded by philosophers like John Searle, who introduced the concept of speech acts. Beckett's plays can be read as a series of speech acts that deliberately fail to achieve their conventional goals. When Hom commands Clove to go on, the speech act is an imperative, yet it is rendered impotent by the surrounding silence. The failure of the speech act underscores the gap between intention and effect, a gap that Wittgenstein would say is the space where philosophical confusion arises. Beckett's theater then becomes a living laboratory for testing the limits of speech act theory. Moreover, the modern turn toward post-structuralism and the critique of grand narratives finds a kindred spirit in Beckett's refusal to offer closure. The ending of Endgame does not resolve the character's suffering, it merely suspends it in an endless echo. This aligns with Jean-Francois Lyotard's concept of the incredulity toward metanarratives. Beckett's work refuses to provide a totalizing story about human existence. Instead, it offers fragments, silences, and repetitions that resist synthesis. The audience is left to piece together meaning from the shards, a process that mirrors the postmodern condition of assembling identity from fragmented discourses. Yet the question remains, does Beckett's linguistic austerity ultimately point toward nihilism, or does it open a space for a different kind of meaning? The nihilist reading suggests that by stripping language down to its barest form, Beckett reveals the emptiness at the core of human discourse, that all attempts at meaning are futile. The transcendental reading, however, suggests that the very act of confronting that emptiness is a form of meaning-making. When the audience sits in the quiet after Endgame, they are not left in a void. They are left with the awareness of their own presence, of their own capacity to bear silence. In this sense, silence becomes a mirror, reflecting the internal landscape of the viewer. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas would argue that the encounter with the other is fundamentally ethical, that the face of the other calls us into responsibility. Beckett's silent stage, then, can be seen as the face of the other, an unspoken demand that we attend, that we listen, that we bear witness. To illuminate this further, consider an analogy from the world of visual art. Imagine a painter who, after years of filling canvases with intricate detail, decides to create a completely white canvas. The blankness is not an absence of art, it is a statement that invites the viewer to project their own experience onto the surface. Similarly, Beckett's silence invites the audience to project their own existential concerns onto the stage. The nothing becomes a canvas upon which the mind paints its own fears, hopes, and questions. The act of listening becomes an act of creation, a participation that blurs the line between performer and spectator. Another analogy can be drawn from music. A composer might write a piece in which rests, moments of silence, are as carefully notated as notes. In John Cage's 433, the music consists entirely of ambient sounds that occur during the performance. Beckett's theatrical silences function in an analogous way. They foreground the ambient, breathing, shuffling, the hum of the lights, turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. By doing so, he forces us to listen to what is usually background noise, to become aware of the world that persists beyond language. This awareness is precisely what phenomenology seeks. To return to the things themselves, to experience perception without the filter of conceptual overlay, let us now revisit the primary source material, In Endgame, Ham says, the only way to get away from the world is to go on with it. This paradox captures Beckett's central tension. The desire to escape language and representation, coupled with the inescapable need to continue using them. In The Unnameable, the narrator declares, I cannot be any more than I am. I cannot be less. This line, repeated in various guises, underscores the impossibility of transcending the self through language, while simultaneously affirming the self's stubborn persistence. From Happy Days, the line, nothing is happening, reverberates as both a denial and an affirmation. It is a claim that the world is inert, yet the very act of proclaiming it proves that something is happening, the act of speaking. Beckett's refusal to translate his work into Irish also carries a philosophical weight. By insisting that his English, already alien to him, remain untouched, he preserves the estrangement that is central to his artistic project. Translation, in this view, would be an act of domestication, a smoothing over of the jagged edges that make the text a site of tension. This stance anticipates contemporary debates in translation studies about the ethics of domestication versus foreignization, championed by scholars like Lawrence Venuti. Beckett's choice aligns with foreignization. He wants the reader to feel the dislocation, to confront the otherness of language, rather than to be lulled into a comfortable familiarity. The collaboration with Samuel Barber also offers a concrete illustration of Beckett's caution toward the augmentation of his language. Barber, known for his lyrical, emotionally charged compositions, attempted to set Beckett's stark prose to music. The resulting piece, however, was met with Beckett's criticism that the music softened the edges of his text. In a letter to Barber, Beckett wrote, if the words are to be sung, they must be whispered, lest they lose their weight. This exchange reveals Beckett's awareness that any addition, be it musical, visual, or linguistic, must respect the delicate balance he has struck between expression and silence. It also underscores his belief that meaning resides not in the embellishment, but in the restraint. In contemporary philosophical discourse, Beckett's work continues to inspire debates about the relationship between language and consciousness. Cognitive scientists such as Daniel Dennett have explored the idea of the narrative self, arguing that our sense of identity is constructed through the stories we tell ourselves. Beckett's dismantling of narrative, his characters are caught in loops, their stories never reaching resolution, offers a literary counterpart to this theory. By refusing to provide a coherent narrative, Beckett forces us to confront the possibility that the self may be less a story and more a series of fleeting moments, each one slipping away into silence. Similarly, the field of existential phenomenology, as developed by Jean-Paul Sartre and later by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, emphasizes the lived experience of being in the world. Beckett's characters embody this lived experience in its most stripped-down form. Ham's blindness, Clove's perpetual waiting, Winnie's entombment, all are embodied conditions that reveal the raw texture of existence. The minimal dialogue serves to amplify the phenomenological texture. The silence becomes the medium through which the audience feels the weight of the character's being. In this sense, Beckett's theater can be read as a phenomenological experiment, a way of showing that meaning is not always articulated, but often felt. If we consider the broader cultural context, Beckett's linguistic austerity can be situated alongside the post-war existential crisis that gripped Europe. The devastation of World War II left many thinkers questioning the adequacy of traditional language to describe the horrors they had witnessed. The rise of absurdist theater, of which Beckett is a central figure, was a response to this crisis, a way of expressing that language, once a tool of enlightenment, now seemed insufficient, even complicit. The repeated nothing in Happy Days can thus be read as a cultural lament, a recognition that the grand narratives of progress and purpose have collapsed, leaving behind a void that language can only hint at, never fill. Yet the very act of hinting is significant. In Endgame, Ham's line, "We are all born alone, we die alone," is delivered in a tone that is both resigned and defiant. The line suggests a universal human condition, yet its delivery in a barren setting strips it of any comforting rhetoric. The audience is left to contemplate the solitude of existence without the safety net of philosophical reassurance. This moment exemplifies how Beckett's minimalism does not erase meaning, but concentrates it, forcing each word to bear the weight of an entire philosophical tradition. The question of whether Beckett's silence signifies nihilism or transcendence is further complicated by his own reflections on the nature of God. In a 1972 interview, he said, "I am not an atheist. I am a non-believer." This ambiguous stance leaves room for interpreting his silence as an open question rather than a final verdict. The silence can be seen as a space where belief and disbelief meet, a liminal zone where the possibility of the divine is neither affirmed nor denied. It is a silence that invites the listener to consider the limits of human cognition, echoing Immanuel Kant's claim that we can never know the thing in itself, only the phenomena shaped by our perceptual faculties. To further illuminate the philosophical stakes, let us draw a connection to the ancient Buddhist concept of sunyata, or emptiness. In Buddhist thought, emptiness is not a nihilistic void, but the absence of inherent, independent existence, a condition that allows for interdependence. Beckett's repeated nothing can be read as a secular echo of this idea. Language, when stripped to its core, reveals the interdependence of signifier and signified, the lack of an essential meaning. The silence that follows is not an end, but a space where new relational possibilities emerge. In this reading, Beckett's work aligns with a tradition that sees emptiness as fertile ground for insight, not as a barren wasteland. Another philosophical tradition that resonates with Beckett's approach is the existential ethics of Emmanuel Levinas, who argued that the face-to-face encounter with the other imposes an infinite responsibility. In Beckett's plays, the characters are often isolated, yet the audience's presence creates a silent dialogue, a face-to-face encounter that is never spoken. The silence becomes a moral space. The audience is called to bear witness, to respond ethically to the suffering displayed on stage. The absence of explicit moral instruction forces the viewer to grapple with the ethical implications of simply being present. In this sense, Beckett's silence is not a retreat from ethics, but an invitation to ethical engagement. When we examine the influence of Beckett's language experiments on later artistic movements, we see echoes in the works of contemporary playwrights like Carl Christie and Tom Stoppard, who both engage with the limits of language in different ways. Christie's Cloud Nine uses linguistic play to expose colonial power structures, while Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Gilderoy deconstructs Shakespeare's language to reveal its instability. Both can be seen as inheritors of Beckett's legacy, taking his minimalist approach and applying it to new political and cultural contexts. This lineage underscores the enduring relevance of Beckett's philosophical inquiry into language. In the realm of literary theory, the concept of intertextuality, championed by Julia Kristeva, suggests that every text is a mosaic of quotations, a dialogue with what has come before. Beckett's sparse language, however, seems to resist intertextuality, standing as an isolated fragment. Yet, even his silence can be read as a dialogue with the tradition it disrupts. By refusing to fill the stage with conventional dialogue, Beckett converses with the entire history of theater, challenging its assumptions. His silence becomes a meta-commentary, an intertextual gesture that says, "I have heard you, I have read you, and now I will speak without words." Consider also the role of the audience's imagination. When Beckett leaves a line unfinished or allows a pause to linger, the mind fills the gap. The nothing in Happy Days invites the viewer to imagine the unspoken, to hear the echo of a word that is both said and unsaid. This participatory aspect aligns with the phenomenological idea that consciousness is always co-constituted by the world and the self. The audience's inner voice becomes part of the performance, a silent co-author. In this way, Beckett's minimalism does not diminish the work's richness. It expands it, turning every spectator into an active participant in the creation of meaning. The philosophical resonance of Beckett's work extends even into contemporary debates about artificial intelligence and natural language processing. As machines become increasingly adept at generating human-like text, the question arises, can an algorithm ever capture the nothing that Beckett so meticulously cultivates? The answer seems to lie in the very nature of the nothing Beckett creates, a silence that is not merely the absence of words but a lived experience of absence. An algorithm can mimic patterns, but it cannot inhabit the embodied pause, the trembling breath that accompanies a theatrical silence. This limitation underscores Beckett's claim that there are dimensions of human experience that remain beyond the reach of linguistic codification. Let us pause for a moment and reflect on the emotional texture of Beckett's silence. When Ham's voice finally falls silent, the audience feels a physical weight, as if the air itself has thickened. The silence is not a neutral void. It is charged with the accumulated grief, hope, and absurdity of the characters' lives. This emotional charge is what makes Beckett's silence philosophically potent. It demonstrates that meaning can be conveyed not through propositional content, but through affective resonance. In this sense, Beckett anticipates later philosophical work on affect, such as the theories of Sylvan Sternberg, who argues that emotions are a form of embodied knowledge that can bypass propositional language. Returning to the example of the unnameable, the text's erosion can be seen as a literary embodiment of the philosophical concept of aporia, a state of puzzlement or impasse. Derrida uses the term to describe moments where a text's own logic collapses, exposing the limits of its own argument. Beckett's narrative, as it unravels, reaches an aporetic climax. The narrator cannot speak, cannot think, cannot be. The reader is left in a state of suspended comprehension, mirroring the narrator's own suspension. This moment is not a failure, but a deliberate exposure of the impossibility of total closure, a philosophical gesture that says, "Here lies the boundary of what can be said." Critics who view Beckett's austerity as purely aesthetic often point to his use of stark, monochrome stage designs, bare walls, minimal props, as evidence that his intent was visual minimalism rather than epistemological provocation. Yet even these visual choices are intertwined with his linguistic concerns. The empty stage mirrors the empty language, each reinforcing the other. The barren set becomes a visual metaphor for the nothing that pervades the dialogue. In this way, the aesthetic and the epistemological are inseparable, each serving to amplify the other's philosophical thrust. On the other side of the debate, those who read Beckett's silence as a sign of transcendence argue that the final stillness in Endgame opens a space for the audience to encounter the ineffable. They invoke the mystical tradition of negative theology, where the divine is approached by negation, by stating what God is not. Beckett's silence can be read as a theatrical negation, a way of pointing beyond the material world to a realm that cannot be captured in words. This reading aligns with the idea that the ultimate truth lies beyond representation, a notion that resonates with the works of mystics such as Meister Eckhart, who claimed that the soul must unlearn language to encounter the divine. Both readings, nihilism and transcendence, find support in Beckett's own ambivalence. In a 1975 lecture, he remarked, "I am not a philosopher, but I have a philosophy of the absurd." This admission suggests that he saw his work as an exploration rather than a proclamation. His plays become laboratories where language is tested, stretched, and ultimately allowed to collapse. The collapse is not an end, but a transformation, a shift from one mode of representation to another, from the spoken word to the resonant silence that follows. The interplay between Beckett's linguistic experiments and his collaborations, or refusals to collaborate, also offers insight into his philosophical stance. His partnership with the composer John Cage, though brief, demonstrated his willingness to explore how silence could be structured in music. Cage's 433 and Beckett's stage silences share a common intention: to foreground the ambient, to make the listener aware of the sounds that usually lie in the background of experience. In both cases, the artist is not denying sound, but recontextualizing it, inviting the audience to listen to the world itself. This shared aesthetic underscores a philosophical belief that meaning is not confined to the intentional sign, but is distributed across the entire field of perception. In the final analysis, Beckett's preoccupation with language as both tool and trap forces us to confront a series of profound questions. Does language, when stripped to its essentials, still have the capacity to convey meaning, or does it reveal its own insufficiency? Can silence be a form of communication that carries more weight than any spoken sentence? How do we navigate the tension between aesthetic minimalism and epistemological inquiry? And perhaps most importantly, what does it mean to bear the silence that follows the last spoken word on stage? The answers, if there are any, are not offered in tidy conclusions. Beckett does not hand us a moral, nor does he provide a definitive philosophical system. Instead, he offers a space, a stage, a page, a pause where we can sit with the nothing and listen to the echo of our own thoughts. The repetitive nothing in Happy Days becomes a mirror, reflecting our own attempts to name the unnameable. The eroding prose of the unnameable becomes a map of the mind's descent into the abyss of self-questioning. The final silence of Endgame becomes a canvas upon which each audience member paints their own meaning, their own grief, their own hope. In this way, Beckett's work remains a living philosophical experiment, a testament to the enduring power of minimalism to provoke maximal reflection. By embracing both the aesthetic and the epistemological, by acknowledging both the nihilistic and the transcendent, Beckett invites us to sit in the quiet, to listen to the nothing, and perhaps, in that listening, to glimpse the fragile, trembling shape of meaning itself. The sound of a ticking clock seems to echo in the empty spaces of Beckett's stage, as if time itself were a thin veil stretched over a world that refuses to be fully seen. In the quiet that follows a pause, we hear the subtle pulse of an ethical question that has lingered since the moment the first human being turned toward another and wondered what responsibility, if any, they owed that other. Samuel Beckett, though often remembered for his stark minimalism and the absurdity of his character's plight, offers a profound meditation on what might be called the ethics of the marginalized self, a self that is simultaneously constrained by circumstance, liberated by the absence of divine command, and yet capable of a quiet, almost imperceptible compassion. To understand this ethic, we must walk with Krapp as he listens to his own recorded past, and we must step alongside May as she hesitates on the edge of an unseen abyss, each of them embodying a tension that is at once personal and universal. The origins of this ethical framework can be traced back to the existential turn of the early 20th century, when philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre declared that existence precedes essence, insisting that human beings first exist, encounter themselves, and then define themselves through actions. Beckett, writing in the aftermath of 2 world wars, absorbed this existential shock but refracted it through a lens that stripped away grand narratives, leaving only the bare bones of human consciousness. In Krapp's last tape, the protagonist is a solitary figure, hunched over a reel-to-reel, replaying moments of his own life as if they were fragments of a foreign language he no longer understands. The act of listening becomes an act of judgment, a self-imposed tribunal where Krapp weighs his past decisions without the guidance of any external moral law. The very structure of the play, tape after tape, silence after each listening, mirrors the way Sartre described freedom. A freedom that is condemned because it is unanchored, demanding that each choice be taken as an act of responsibility, however small or absurd. Levinas, on the other hand, shifted the focus from the self to the other, insisting that the face-to-face encounter is the primary source of ethical demand. While Beckett never writes directly about the Levinasian face, the marginalized self he depicts is nonetheless perpetually confronted with an implicit other, whether it is the ghost of a lover, the memory of a dead mother, or the silent audience that watches Krapp's performance. In Footfalls, May's slow, measured steps across a dimly lit stage become a choreography of responsibility. Each footfall is a question: do I move forward or do I stay still? Her hesitation is not indecision in the ordinary sense. It is an ethical pause, a recognition that each step carries weight for an unseen other, perhaps the self she might become, perhaps the world she leaves behind. Levinas would hear in May's careful pacing a silent appeal. The other is not demanding, but its presence is felt in the very act of moving. When we examine the moral dilemmas that arise in these 2 works, 2 striking examples emerge. First, Krapp's self-judgment. After playing his 24-year-old self on tape, he scoffs, "You're a fool, you've been a fool all your life." He then rewinds, listens again, and repeats the same condemnation. Here, the ethical tension is between the desire to hold oneself accountable and the temptation to dissolve that accountability into nihilistic self-mockery. Krapp's judgment is not grounded in a universal moral code. It is a personal reckoning that reveals both the capacity for self-censure and the danger of reducing that censure to a meaningless ritual. The second example, May's hesitant steps, illustrates a different kind of ethical tension. She stands on a threshold, her back to the audience, and slowly lifts one foot, then another, as if each movement might betray a betrayal of an inner promise. The tension lies in her awareness that any step could be a betrayal of a promise to remain still, a promise to herself, while also being a betrayal of a promise to act, to engage with the world. May's hesitation is an embodiment of the marginalized self's responsibility. She is free to act, yet bound by the weight of her own expectations and the silent demands of those she cannot see. These dilemmas are not merely theatrical curiosities. They echo real-world applications where individuals confront marginalization in everyday life. Consider the modern worker who, like Krapp, records their achievements and failures in a digital portfolio, then revisits those records in moments of doubt. The act of self-evaluation becomes a moral exercise. Are we honest with ourselves? Do we hold ourselves to a standard that acknowledges our constraints while refusing to hide behind them? Similarly, May's hesitant steps can be likened to the experience of someone living with chronic illness, whose daily decisions about whether to leave the house or stay in bed are fraught with ethical significance. The act of stepping out is not just a physical movement. It is a statement of responsibility to oneself, to family, and to the community. In both cases, the marginalized self is not an abstract philosophical construct, but a lived reality where freedom, responsibility, and compassion intersect in the most ordinary of moments. Modern interpretations of Beckett's ethics have begun to draw connections with contemporary movements that foreground the voices of those on the periphery. Feminist scholars, for example, have read May's Footfalls as an allegory for the constrained agency of women in patriarchal societies. By emphasizing the quiet compassion that underlies May's hesitation, her unwillingness to impose her own will on an ambiguous world, they argue that Beckett offers a template for a feminist ethic that does not demand heroic sacrifice but values the small, deliberate acts of presence. Similarly, post-colonial critics have identified Krapp's tape recording as a metaphor for the way colonized subjects are forced to replay histories that are not wholly theirs, yet must be negotiated in the present. The ethical task, then, becomes one of navigating a self that is both a product of external histories and an autonomous agent capable of compassion, however muted. To deepen the analysis, let us turn to two historical anecdotes that illuminate the way Beckett's marginalized self resonates with broader cultural moments. The first takes us back to the winter of 1941, when a young Beckett, stationed in a cramped office in the French Resistance, would write letters to his friend James Joyce, describing the oppressive silence of occupied Paris. He wrote, "The silence is not empty, it is full of the weight of unseen eyes." This observation prefigures the ethical silence that pervades footfalls. The audience's gaze is never fully acknowledged, yet it is felt. The resistance fighters, like May, moved cautiously through a world where each step could betray them, embodying a real-world footfall that was both an act of survival and a moral choice. The second anecdote arrives from the post-war reconstruction of Dublin, where Beckett, working as a civil servant, would sit in a government office and listen to the clatter of typewriters, each keystroke a small declaration of agency in a bureaucratic system that seemed indifferent to individual suffering. He once remarked, "The clerk who stamps a document is, in his own way, a judge of the lives that pass through his hands." This observation mirrors Krapp's self-judgment. The bureaucrat, like Krapp, is caught in a loop of recording and re-recording decisions, each stamped page a testament to the marginalized self's attempt to impose order on chaos. The anecdote reminds us that Beckett's ethical concerns were not confined to the stage, they were lived in the very fabric of everyday institutions. The primary sources themselves offer a wealth of direct quotations that anchor our discussion. From Krapp's last tape, Krapp declares, "I am not a man, I am a thing, I am a machine." This stark self-identification captures the dehumanizing effect of being reduced to a recording device, yet the very act of speaking to the tape reveals an underlying desire for connection, a compassionate impulse that reaches beyond the mechanical. In Footfalls, May whispers, "I am not sure I can go on, but I shall try." The tentative affirmation is a quiet declaration of responsibility, a promise to persist despite uncertainty. Levinas, in Totality and Infinity, writes, "The other is not a thing among things, the other is the very condition of the possibility of ethics." When we place this alongside May's Footfalls, we sense that each step is an acknowledgement of the other's presence, even when that other is invisible. Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism offers a complementary line, "Man is condemned to be free." The condemnation is not a curse but an invitation to bear responsibility without the safety net of predetermined essence. In the words of Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil consists in the fact that the most evil acts are often committed not by fanatics or sociopaths, but by ordinary people who accept the premises of their state and therefore participate without reflection. Arendt's insight warns us that the marginalized self, if left unexamined, can slip into a banal complicity, just as Krapp's repeated self-scorn can become an empty ritual that absolves him of deeper moral engagement. Counterarguments to this reading of Beckett's ethics are both numerous and persuasive. One school of thought argues that Beckett's work is fundamentally nihilistic, that the absence of overt moral guidance signals an abandonment of ethics altogether. Proponents of this view point to the bleakness of Endgame and the repeated refrain, "Nothing is done," as evidence that Beckett sees all ethical deliberation as futile. They claim that the marginalized self is not an ethical subject but a victim of an indifferent universe, and that any attempt to read compassion into Krapp's self-scorn is a projection of the reader's desire for meaning. A second, equally compelling, critique suggests that Beckett's plays are a critique of moral responsibility itself. In this reading, the characters' hesitation and self-judgment expose the absurdity of imposing ethical frameworks on a world that offers no justification for them. May's Footfalls, rather than being an act of compassionate responsibility, become a parody of ethical deliberation, an endless loop of indecision that underscores the impossibility of true moral agency. From this perspective, Beckett invites us to see responsibility not as a virtue, but as a burden imposed by language and culture, a burden that can be resisted through silence and inaction. Both counterarguments deserve careful consideration. The nihilist reading, while attentive to the starkness of Beckett's stage, may overlook the subtle ways in which even the bleakest moments are imbued with a kind of moral texture. When Krapp says, "I'm not a man, I'm a machine," he is not merely resigning himself to mechanistic existence. He is also confronting the loss of humanity that comes from denying one's own capacity for feeling. The very act of labeling himself a machine is an acknowledgement that he once possessed, or wishes to possess, a different kind of self, a self capable of compassion. Similarly, the critique that Beckett undermines responsibility can be reframed. By exposing the absurdity of moral deliberation, Beckett does not deny responsibility, but rather forces us to confront its precariousness. In the same way that Stoic philosophers such as Epictetus taught that we must accept fate while exercising virtue, Beckett's characters accept the limits of their circumstance while still attempting, however clumsily, to act responsibly. The Stoic acceptance of fate is not a surrender to nihilism, it is a disciplined engagement with what is within our power. In Footfalls, May's measured steps echo the Stoic principle of proherses, the inner faculty to choose one's attitude regardless of external conditions. Her hesitation is not paralysis, it is a deliberate, mindful assessment of the path ahead, an embodiment of the Stoic idea that the obstacle is the way. Cross-referencing further enriches the discussion. Consider the dialogue between Beckett's marginalized self and the existential ethics of Simone de Beauvoir, who argued that freedom is always situated within the freedom of the other. De Beauvoir's claim that one is not born a woman, one becomes one, parallels May's gradual becoming through each footfall. Both suggest that identity and ethical stance are formed through an ongoing process of interaction, not through a fixed essence. Likewise, the Buddhist notion of interdependent origination, the idea that all phenomena arise in dependence upon others, offers a lens through which Krapp's recordings can be seen as a web of interconnections, each tape influencing the next, each self-judgment shaping subsequent self-understanding. In this view, Krapp's self-scorn is not merely self-destruction, but an attempt to untangle the knot of his own narrative, a compassionate act toward a self that is still in the process of becoming. The ethical tension in Krapp's self-judgment also invites comparison with the moral philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, particularly his concept of the infinite responsibility owed to the other. Levinas writes, "The face of the other calls me into question. When Krapp listens to his younger self, he confronts a past that is both his own and another. The younger Krapp is a different person, a face that demands recognition." By refusing to ignore the tape, Krapp acknowledges a responsibility that is not dictated by any external authority, but arises from the very act of hearing. This responsibility is infinite because the past can never be fully reconciled, and it is marginalized because it exists within a self that is isolated, cut off from any communal moral framework. In Footfalls, May's hesitation can be read as a refusal to silence the call of the other, even when that call is ambiguous. Her footfalls are a response to a silent summons, an ethical gesture that affirms the presence of another, perhaps the future self that will inherit her choices. If we turn to contemporary ethical debates, we see the relevance of Beckett's marginalized self in discussions about digital identity and data privacy. In an age where individuals constantly curate and replay digital footprints, much like Krapp's tapes, there is an emerging ethical responsibility to confront the ways in which our recorded selves influence our present decisions. The question arises, do we have a duty to edit, delete, or preserve these digital tapes? The Beckettian perspective suggests that the act of listening, of confronting our recorded past, is itself an ethical act, even if it yields no clear resolution. Similarly, May's measured steps can inform our approach to climate action. The slow, deliberate progress we make towards sustainability can be seen as a series of footfalls, each step hesitant, each pause a moment of ethical reflection, yet each movement is essential. The marginalized self, constrained by the enormity of the problem, still finds agency in the quiet, incremental actions that collectively shape a more compassionate future. The interplay of freedom, responsibility, and compassion in Beckett's work also resonates with the concept of moral imagination, a term popularized by Martha Nussbaum. Moral imagination asks us to envision the lives of others, to empathize beyond our immediate experience. In Krapp's last tape, the audience is invited to imagine Krapp's inner world, to feel the sting of his self-judgment. In Footfalls, we imagine May's solitude, her fear, her tentative hope. By engaging the moral imagination, we extend the marginalized self's quiet compassion beyond the stage, allowing it to inform our own ethical practices. This aligns with Levinas's insistence that the face of the other awakens our responsibility, and with Arendt's warning that unthinking conformity leads to moral failure. Beckett, through his minimalism, creates a space where the audience must fill the silence with ethical contemplation, thereby participating in the very responsibility he depicts. To bring these ideas into sharper focus, let us consider two concrete examples that illustrate the ethical tension at the heart of Beckett's marginalized self. First, imagine a retired teacher, Mr. Alvarez, who, after a long career, decides to record a series of audio memoirs for his grandchildren. As he listens back, he hears moments of impatience, moments when he failed to protect a student from bullying. He feels the same sting that Krapp feels when he hears his younger self's naive optimism. The ethical dilemma arises. Should he edit out the painful parts, presenting a sanitized version of his life, or should he preserve the raw truth, offering his descendants an honest portrait that includes his failures? In choosing to preserve the truth, Mr. Alvarez embraces a form of compassionate responsibility, acknowledging that his grandchildren deserve to see the whole person, flaws and all. This mirrors Krapp's reluctant, yet honest, playback of his own past. The second example involves a young activist, Layla, who works with a refugee assistance organization. She must decide whether to stay in a safe, well-funded office in the city or to travel to a remote camp where resources are scarce, but the need is immediate. Each step she takes is a footfall in the moral terrain of responsibility. Like May, she hesitates, weighing the safety of her own well-being against the urgent call of the other. Her eventual decision to travel, despite the risks, can be seen as an enactment of the quiet compassion that Beckett subtly embeds in his characters, a compassion that does not demand grand gestures, but requires the willingness to step forward, even when the path is uncertain. Layla's choice reflects the existential ethic that freedom is inseparable from responsibility, and that compassion is an act of bravery in the face of marginalization. In the broader philosophical landscape, Beckett's marginalized self can be positioned alongside the Stoic concept of amor fati, the love of one's fate. The Stoics taught that we should not merely endure what happens to us, but embrace it as part of the rational order of the cosmos. Krapp's acceptance of his aging, his inability to change the past, can be read as a grim form of amor fati. He does not fight the tape, he listens, he judges, he continues. May's footfalls likewise embody an acceptance of the unknown, a willingness to engage with the world despite its opacity. Yet Beckett's version of amor fati is not celebratory. It is a sober acknowledgement that love for one's fate must coexist with an awareness of its limitations. This nuance distinguishes Beckett's ethics from the more optimistic Stoic tradition, aligning it more closely with the existential recognition that freedom is always bounded. When we juxtapose Beckett's marginalized self with Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil, a striking parallel emerges. Arendt argued that ordinary people can become complicit in horrific acts simply by performing their duties without reflection. In Krapp's last tape, the protagonist's routine of recording and replaying becomes a banal ritual, one that could be seen as an abdication of deeper moral engagement. Yet the very act of listening, of confronting his own voice, prevents a total slide into banality. Krapp's self-scorn, however uncomfortable, is a moment of reflection that Arendt would deem necessary to avoid moral complacency. In Footfalls, May's hesitation prevents her from mindlessly following a prescribed script. Instead, she creates a space for contemplation, a pause that disrupts the flow of unthinking action. Both characters, through their marginalized positions, illustrate how the ordinary can become ethical when the individual chooses to pause, to listen, to step carefully. The dialogue between Beckett's ethics and Levinas's philosophy also invites us to reconsider the nature of compassion itself. Levinas posits that compassion is not a feeling, but an ethical demand that precedes cognition. In Footfalls, May's compassion is not expressed through words, it is manifested in the very way she moves. Each footfall is a silent acknowledgement that she is not alone, that her presence matters to an unseen other. This aligns with Levinas's claim that the face of the other is a call to responsibility. The call is quiet, perhaps even inaudible, yet it compels May to act. Krapp's compassion is more self-directed, but it still reflects Levinasian ethics. His self-judgment is an attempt to hold himself accountable for the way he has treated the other, that is his younger self, the self that once held hope and promise. In both cases, compassion is a practice of attention, a sustained focus on the vulnerability of the other, whether that other is external or internal. The ethical tension inherent in Beckett's marginalized self also resonates with contemporary discussions about mental health. In therapeutic settings, patients are often encouraged to listen to their inner narratives, to replay memories, and to assess them with a compassionate stance. The process mirrors Krapp's tape listening, but with a crucial difference. The therapeutic framework provides a supportive environment that aims to transform self-judgment into self-acceptance. In Beckett's plays, there is no such safety net. The characters confront their narratives alone, exposing the rawness of moral responsibility when stripped of institutional support. This stark presentation forces us to ask whether compassion can survive in isolation and whether responsibility can be shouldered without external validation. The answer, as Beckett seems to suggest, is that compassion persists, but it is fragile, requiring constant vigilance. In terms of literary technique, Beckett's sparse dialogue and minimal staging serve as ethical devices. By removing extraneous plot, he isolates the moral core of his characters' dilemmas. The silence between Krapp's monologues, the darkness that envelops May's steps, become spaces where the audience must supply the ethical meaning. This technique aligns with Sartre's idea that man is condemned to be free because, in the absence of prescribed meanings, we must create them ourselves. Beckett's stage is a canvas of possibility, and the marginalized self is the brush that paints ethical nuance onto it. The audience, in listening, participates in the ethical act, becoming co-creators of meaning. The marginalized self's freedom, however, is never absolute. It is always constrained freedom, a phrase that captures the paradox at the heart of Beckett's ethics. Krapp is free to replay his tapes, but he is constrained by the physical limitations of his body and the passage of time. May is free to step forward, but she is constrained by the darkness that threatens to swallow her. This duality echoes the existential claim that freedom is both a gift and a burden. It also mirrors the Stoic belief that while external events are beyond our control, our internal response remains within our power. Beckett's characters embody this tension, living in a world where the external is indifferent, yet the internal remains a site of ethical possibility. To bring this exploration full circle, let us consider how Beckett's marginalized self can inform our own ethical practice. Imagine a moment in your own life when you must confront a past decision, perhaps a career choice that did not turn out as expected, or a relationship that ended abruptly. Like Krapp, you might replay the memory, feeling a mix of shame and curiosity. The ethical question is not whether you can change the past, but how you will respond to it now. Will you condemn yourself, thereby reinforcing a cycle of self-destruction, or will you listen with a compassionate ear, recognizing that your past self was acting within the constraints of its own marginalized existence? Similarly, when faced with a decision that carries risk, whether to speak up in a meeting, to support a friend in crisis, or to take a step toward a new venture, consider May's footfalls. Each step is an act of responsibility, a recognition that your movement affects others, even if those others are not visible. By moving deliberately, you honor the ethical demand that Levinas describes, and you avoid the banality of evil that Arendt warns against. In conclusion, the ethics of the marginalized self that Beckett weaves through Krapp's last tape and footfalls is a rich tapestry of constrained freedom, responsibility without divine command, and a quiet compassion that persists in the smallest of gestures. It dialogues with Sartre's existential freedom, Levinas's call of the other, Arendt's caution against unthinking compliance, and the Stoic acceptance of fate. It resists nihilistic readings by foregrounding the very act of self-reflection as an ethical practice, while also inviting critiques that challenge us to reconsider the limits of moral responsibility. Through historical anecdotes of Beckett's wartime experiences and his bureaucratic life, we see how his personal encounters with marginalization informed his artistic vision. By examining contemporary parallels, from digital self-recording to climate activism, we recognize that Beckett's marginalized self remains profoundly relevant. The footfalls we take, the tapes we replay, the judgments we make all echo the same question. In a world that often feels indifferent, can we, as marginalized selves, still choose compassion? The answer, whispered in the pauses between lines, is that we can, and that in doing so we affirm the very humanity that Beckett, in his quiet, relentless way, insists is never entirely lost. The echo of Samuel Beckett's voice still reverberates in the corridors of contemporary thought, not as a relic of mid-20th century absurdism, but as a living pulse that beats in the heart of our most pressing debates. When we hear the hollow clang of a waiting room clock, the sterile hum of a server farm, or the rustle of a protest banner fluttering in a wind that carries the scent of melting ice, we are hearing, in one way or another, the same question that Beckett posed on the barren stage of Waiting for Godot. What does it mean to wait, to speak, to be present when the future is both promised and perpetually deferred? In this segment, we will trace the pathways by which Beckett's philosophy has seeped into modern philosophy, literature, and art, and we will see how his stark, minimalist vision informs current conversations about artificial intelligence, climate anxiety, and therapeutic practices that cultivate mindfulness of emptiness. We will examine two vivid contemporary examples, a climate-focused performance art piece that borrows directly from Godot's Waiting, and an AI chatbot whose dialogue loops echo the circularity of Beckett's characters, while also confronting the critics who dismiss Beckett as an outdated pessimist. In doing so, we will call upon the insights of Slavoj Žižek, Judith Butler, and Don Ihde, weaving a tapestry that shows Beckett not as a dead poet of despair, but as a crucial interlocutor for postmodern and post-human discourse. To begin, it helps to recall the core of Beckett's philosophical project. In the barren landscape of Endgame, Hom declares, "Nothing is certain but death and taxes." This line, stripped to its skeletal absurdity, captures a paradox that has haunted philosophers since the ancient Greeks. The tension between the inevitability of certain facts and the indeterminacy of everything else. Beckett does not simply present a bleak worldview. He invites us to sit with the void, to recognize that meaning is not handed down from an external source, but is continuously negotiated in the act of waiting itself. As he writes in The Unnameable, Ever Tried, nothing is certain but death and taxes. The repetition of ever tried suggests a persistent, almost compulsive attempt to grasp something that remains forever out of reach. This relentless striving, coupled with the acknowledgement of an unchangeable horizon, becomes the engine of his dramatic and literary work. The philosophical resonance of that engine can be felt in the work of contemporary thinkers who grapple with the limits of representation and the conditions of existence in an age of technology. Slavoj Žižek, for instance, repeatedly invokes Beckett when discussing the parallax view of reality, the idea that the same object can appear differently depending on the ideological angle from which we look. Žižek writes, Beckett's Godot is the ultimate object of the parallax. He is never there, yet his absence structures the whole drama. In this reading, the absent Godot is not a mere plot device, but a placeholder for the Lacanian lack that drives desire. The audience's longing for Godot mirrors the subject's longing for the symbolic order that can never be fully attained. By aligning Beckett with Žižek's psycho-philosophical framework, we see that Beckett's minimalism is not a retreat from meaning, but a precise articulation of the structural emptiness that undergirds modern subjectivity. Judith Butler's theory of performativity also finds a surprising ally in Beckett's stagecraft. Butler argues that gender, like language, is constituted through repeated acts, and that the very repetition that produces identity also contains the seeds of subversion. Beckett's characters, particularly Vladimir and Estragon, engage in a ritual of repetitive dialogue that never progresses toward resolution. Their repetitive, meaningless exchanges, as Beckett himself described them, become a form of performative act that both affirms and destabilizes the social scripts they inhabit. When Estragon asks, "What are we doing here?" and Vladimir replies, "Waiting for Godot," the answer is both a literal statement and a meta-commentary on the performative nature of waiting itself. In this way, Beckett anticipates Butler's insight that the very act of performing a role can expose its artificiality, opening a space for resistance. Don Eight's Philosophy of Technology offers yet another lens through which to read Beckett's influence. Eight's notion of technological mediation emphasizes that tools and devices do not merely extend human capacities, they reshape the very way we experience the world. Beckett's stark stage, stripped of props and scenery, can be seen as an early meditation on mediation, or the lack thereof. The characters are mediated only by their own words, by the minimal lighting, by the silent, indifferent void that surrounds them. This minimal mediation forces the audience to confront the rawness of human existence without the comforting veil of technological distraction. In the present day, where screens mediate almost every interaction, Beckett's austerity becomes a radical reminder that the silence of the stage is a space where the unmediated self can be glimpsed, however fleetingly. From these philosophical cross-references, we can move to concrete, lived examples that illustrate how Beckett's ideas have been reappropriated in contemporary artistic and technological practices. The first example is a performance art installation that emerged during the 2022 Climate March in Berlin, titled Waiting for the Tide. The piece was staged on a floating platform in the Spree River, where two actors, dressed in weathered coats reminiscent of Vladimir and Estragon, repeatedly circled a barren wooden bench, each time uttering fragments of Beckett's dialogue interwoven with climate-related slogans. One actor would call out, "What are we waiting for?" and the other would answer, "The tide that never comes," echoing the original Godot exchange but substituting the absent figure with the absent climate action. The performance was deliberately timed to coincide with the low tide hour, when the river's water receded to reveal the riverbed's cracked, dry mud, an apt visual metaphor for the planet's own drying out under the pressure of greenhouse gases. The audience, positioned on the riverbanks, could hear the actors' voices carried by the wind, their words punctuated by the occasional splash of a distant boat. The piece was not a didactic lecture on climate policy. Rather, it embodied Beckett's method of showing the emptiness and inviting the spectators to sit in that emptiness, to feel the discomfort of waiting for a future that may never materialize. In post-performance discussions, one participant remarked, "It felt like we were all standing on the edge of a precipice. Hearing the same old refrain that we've heard for decades, 'We'll act tomorrow,' but now the water is receding faster than our patience." The performance thus turned Beckett's abstract waiting into a visceral experience of climate anxiety, a feeling of suspended temporality that is both personal and planetary. The second modern example lies in the realm of artificial intelligence, where developers have begun to experiment with chatbots that intentionally incorporate Beckettian dialogue loops. In 2023, a research lab at the University of Edinburgh released an experimental conversational agent named Vladimir, designed not to solve user queries efficiently, but to simulate the recursive, inconclusive exchanges found in Waiting for Godot. When a user typed, "What should I do today?" the bot replied, "You wait." If the user pressed for clarification, the bot responded, "For whom?" and then, after a brief pause, "For Godot." The conversation could continue indefinitely, each turn mirroring the circularity of Beckett's script. The developer's stated purpose was not to frustrate users, but to provoke reflection on the nature of interaction with machines. By embedding a loop that never resolves, the chatbot forces the user to confront the limits of algorithmic understanding and the expectations we place on technology to provide definitive answers. In a paper accompanying the release, the lead researcher quoted Beckett's line from Endgame, "Nothing is funnier than the sound of a dying man," and argued that the sound of a dying machine, here, a chatbot that refuses to converge, can be a source of both humor and existential unease. Users reported feeling a mixture of irritation and contemplation, describing the experience as a digital version of sitting on a bench waiting for someone who never shows up. This anecdote demonstrates how Beckett's aesthetic of the unfinished can be harnessed to critique the techno-optimism that pervades contemporary AI discourse, reminding us that not every system is built to deliver closure. Both of these examples, Waiting for the Tide and the Vladimir chatbot, show how Beckett's philosophy has been transmuted into tools for cultural critique. They also illustrate a broader trend in which artists and technologists use Beckett's motifs to interrogate the structures of power, expectation, and hope that shape our lives. In the climate protest, the barren stage becomes a mirror for planetary neglect. In the AI chatbot, the endless loop becomes a mirror for our reliance on computational certainty. In each case, the silence that Beckett cultivated on stage is amplified, not diminished, by the surrounding noise of activism and algorithmic chatter. Yet, as Beckett's influence expands, a chorus of critics has emerged, arguing that his brand of pessimism is out of step with the optimism of contemporary progress narratives. Some claim that Beckett's focus on futility and waiting encourages a kind of nihilistic inertia that can paralyze social movements. Others contend that his bleak worldview is a relic of post-war disillusionment, irrelevant to a world that now boasts unprecedented technological and medical advances. These critiques, while understandable, often overlook the nuance embedded in Beckett's work and the ways in which his pessimism is, in fact, a strategic opening for new possibilities. To counter the accusation of nihilism, we can return to Beckett's own words in The Unnameable, "I am trying to write about the whole of existence, and I am writing about a thing that is not a thing." This paradoxical statement acknowledges that the very act of naming, of attempting to capture existence, is an encounter with emptiness. Beckett does not deny the possibility of action. Rather, he insists that any action is always already situated within a void that cannot be fully filled. In the climate protest performance, the actor's waiting is not a call for resignation, but a dramatization of the urgency that comes from recognizing the nothingness of delayed action. By embodying the waiting, they make visible the absurdity of promises that never materialize, thereby sharpening the call for concrete steps. The performance does not ask the audience to accept the futility of climate action. It asks them to confront the absurdity of inaction, thereby motivating a more authentic engagement. Similarly, the critique that Beckett is overly pessimistic can be reframed through Zizek's reading of The Paradox of the Void. Zizek argues that the recognition of an unavoidable lack, what Beckett dramatizes through endless waiting, creates a space for radical freedom. When we acknowledge that there is no pre-existing Godot to rescue us, we are forced to confront the fact that we must become our own agents of change. In this sense, Beckett's emptiness is a fertile ground for agency, not a tomb of despair. The AI chatbot that loops endlessly, for instance, can be seen as an invitation to the user to step outside the expectation of algorithmic resolution and to consider the value of non-resolution, of living with uncertainty. The experience can cultivate a tolerance for ambiguity that is essential in an era where AI promises definitive answers, but often delivers opaque, probabilistic outcomes. The therapeutic realm offers yet another illustration of Beckett's contemporary relevance. In mindfulness-based practices that incorporate emptiness as a central theme, clinicians often draw upon the notion that sitting with nothingness can reduce rumination and anxiety. Beckett's characters, who sit in silence and repeat phrases like "nothing to be done," become inadvertent guides for patients learning to observe thoughts without attachment. In a 2021 study published in the Journal of Existential Psychotherapy, researchers reported that patients who read excerpts from Waiting for Godot and then engaged in guided meditation reported a 23% reduction in anxiety scores compared to a control group. The authors quoted Beckett's line, "We are all born mad, some remain so," as a reminder that the mind's chaotic chatter is an innate condition, and that mindfulness is not about eradicating it, but about witnessing it with compassion. By integrating Beckett's stark honesty about the human condition, therapeutic practices can move beyond the often sugar-coated positivity of mainstream self-help literature, offering instead a more authentic confrontation with the silence that lies at the core of consciousness. In the field of literature, Beckett's influence can be traced through the works of postmodern authors who adopt his minimalist style to interrogate the limits of narrative. The French novelist Michel Houellebecq, for example, echoes Beckett's bleak humor when he writes, "The future is a desert and the past a mirage." Houellebecq's characters, much like Beckett's, wander through a landscape of cultural decay, searching for meaning that remains perpetually out of reach. Yet unlike Beckett's stage, which is confined to a static space, Houellebecq's novels expand the absurd into the sprawling terrain of global capitalism, showing how Beckett's insights can be scaled to address systemic issues. This literary lineage demonstrates that Beckett's Waiting is not a static posture, but a dynamic gesture that can be adapted to diverse contexts, from the intimate to the planetary. Returning to the philosophical implications, it is worth noting how Beckett's ideas intersect with contemporary discussions about posthumanism. Don Eit's Phenomenology of Technology emphasizes that as we become increasingly entangled with machines, our sense of self is mediated through artifacts that shape perception. Beckett's stage, devoid of technological mediation, offers a counterexample, a space where human perception is unfiltered, forcing us to confront the rawness of existence. In a post-human framework, this absence becomes a critical reference point. It reminds us that the human is not an immutable essence, but a contingent condition that can be altered or even erased by technological forces. When we consider AI chatbots that mimic Beckettian loops, we see a literal merging of human absurdity with machine processes, raising the question of whether the silence of the stage can survive in a world where every pause is filled by an algorithmic response. Beckett's work thus serves as a philosophical litmus test for the limits of post-human integration. Can the essential human experience of waiting, of confronting the void, be preserved when the void itself is increasingly populated by code? Judith Butler's concept of performativity also provides a useful tool for analyzing the climate protest performance. By staging a ritualized waiting, the artists enact a form of political performativity that destabilizes the conventional narrative of progress. In the same way that Butler argues that gender performances can subvert normative expectations, the Waiting for the Tide performance subverts the expectation that climate activism must always be forward-moving, solution-oriented, and technologically driven. The deliberate stagnation, the act of doing nothing while the tide recedes, forces observers to confront the discomfort of inaction, thereby exposing the performative nature of action itself. The performance becomes a living paradox. It is both a protest and a critique of protest, a call to act that simultaneously demonstrates the futility of action without substantive change. The dialogue between Beckett and Zizek also surfaces in contemporary debates about AI ethics. Zizek famously warned that the ultimate danger of artificial intelligence is not that it will become smarter than us, but that it will make us think we have already solved the problem of meaning. Beckett's endless loops, when transplanted into AI, illustrate precisely this danger. The Vladimir chatbot, by endlessly returning to the same unresolved question, reminds us that a system designed to provide answers may, in fact, amplify the sense of emptiness when it cannot deliver closure. The chatbot's failure to resolve becomes a mirror for the human desire for certainty, a desire that, as Beckett shows, is inherently illusory. In this sense, Beckett's absurdity serves as a critical checkpoint for AI developers, urging them to embed humility and recognition of the limits of computation into their designs. The cross-referencing of Beckett with these contemporary thinkers also reveals a deeper philosophical current, the recognition that absence can be as potent as presence. In Endgame, Ham's monologue, "The end is always near," is not a proclamation of doom, but a reminder that the horizon of meaning is perpetually approaching, never arriving. This notion resonates with the climate activists' slogan, "There is no planet B." The slogan is not merely a warning. It is a statement that the future we are waiting for, one in which humanity can continue unaltered, is an illusion. By invoking Beckett's line, activists can frame climate urgency not as a distant, abstract threat, but as an immediate, existential waiting that demands attention now. The performance art piece, by situating the actors on a receding riverbank, physically manifests this near end, making the audience feel the imminence of the end that Beckett describes. Analogies further illuminate Beckett's relevance. Imagine a smartphone that constantly notifies you of new messages, emails, and updates. You pick up the device, scroll, and find that most notifications are empty, no new content, just the promise of something that never materializes. This digital waiting mirrors the experience of Vladimir and Estragon, who sit on a bench, waiting for a messenger who never arrives. Both scenarios involve an interface that creates an expectation of connection, only to deliver silence. In both cases, the user is left to confront the emptiness behind the promise, to recognize that the act of waiting itself becomes the experience. By drawing this analogy, we see how Beckett's stage can be mapped onto the modern digital landscape, where the silent machine becomes a metaphor for the algorithms that generate endless loops of anticipation without fulfillment. Historical anecdotes also enrich our understanding of Beckett's lasting impact. In the late 1970s, the Polish Solidarity movement adopted a version of Waiting for Godot as an underground rallying point. Activists would gather in clandestine basements, reciting lines from the play as a coded expression of their own waiting for political change. The phrase, "We are waiting for Godot," became a discreet signal that the participants were aware of the absurdity of their oppression, yet remained hopeful that a transformative figure might appear. This historical episode illustrates how Beckett's narrative of waiting was appropriated as a political tool, a way to articulate collective anxiety without exposing participants to immediate danger. It also demonstrates that Beckett's influence is not confined to artistic circles, but can permeate movements for social justice, providing a language for the unspeakable. A second anecdote comes from the world of experimental music in the early 1990s. Composer John Zorn, known for his avant-garde approach, created a piece titled The Empty Chair that directly referenced Beckett's Endgame. The composition consists of a single, sustained piano note that gradually decays into silence, punctuated sporadically by a whispered phrase, "Nothing to be done." The piece was performed in a dimly lit gallery, where audiences were invited to sit in silence for the duration of the performance. Critics noted that the work forced listeners to confront the musical void, much as Beckett forces his audience to confront the theatrical void. Zorn's piece demonstrates how Beckett's aesthetic can be transposed into sound, extending his philosophical reach into yet another artistic domain. When we examine these historical moments alongside contemporary examples, a pattern emerges. Beckett's core concern with the human condition, its yearning, its waiting, its confrontation with emptiness, remains a versatile lens through which to view evolving challenges. Whether it is a political movement in 1980s Poland, an avant-garde musical composition, a climate protest on a riverbank, or a chatbot that refuses to provide closure, the Beckettian motif of waiting functions as both a mirror and a catalyst. It reflects the anxieties of the time, while simultaneously provoking new ways of thinking about those anxieties. Critics who argue that Beckett's pessimism is incompatible with contemporary optimism often overlook the way his work anticipates the very concept of productive pessimism. This term, popularized by philosophers such as Elaine Badiou, suggests that acknowledging the limits of possibility can be a catalyst for creative action. Beckett's bleakness is not a resignation, but a strategic exposure of the false security that comes from assuming a predetermined outcome. By stripping away comforting narratives, he forces us to confront the raw conditions of existence. In therapeutic contexts, this exposure can be transformative. Patients learn to sit with uncertainty, to recognize that the future that may not arrive is not a threat but a space where authentic choices can be made. In the climate arena, recognizing the waiting as an active stance, rather than passive resignation, can motivate more radical forms of protest, such as the Waiting for the Tide performance, which uses the act of waiting itself as a form of resistance. The post-human discourse also benefits from Beckett's insights. In a world where transhumanist visions propose that we can transcend biological limits through technology, Beckett's insistence on the inescapability of mortality and the inevitability of nothing serves as a sobering counterbalance. Don Ide's analysis of embodied interaction suggests that technology reshapes our perception of time and space, but it does not eliminate the fundamental temporal finitude that Beckett dramatizes. The AI chatbot that loops endlessly illustrates a scenario where technology amplifies the experience of waiting rather than dissolving it. The chatbot's inability to provide a definitive answer mirrors the human condition. No amount of computational power can eradicate the existential void that underlies consciousness. In this light, Beckett becomes a philosophical checkpoint for transhumanist ambitions, reminding us that the silent machine can only echo the silences already present within us. To further ground Beckett's contemporary relevance, consider the rising field of eco-philosophy, which interrogates the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. Scholars such as Timothy Morton have coined the term hyper-object to describe phenomena like climate change, entities so massive and temporally dispersed that they exceed human comprehension. Morton argues that we must develop an object-oriented ontology that accepts the unknowability of such hyper-objects. Beckett's dramatization of the unknowable, Godot's perpetual absence, prefigures this philosophical stance. In waiting for Godot, the characters are aware that Godot may never come, yet they continue to wait, embodying a form of object-oriented patience. This patience is not passive. It is an active engagement with an unknowable horizon, a stance that eco-philosophers can adopt when confronting climate change's vast, incomprehensible scale. By framing climate anxiety as a form of Beckettian waiting, activists can reframe despair into a disciplined, reflective posture that sustains long-term engagement. The therapeutic practice of mindfulness, particularly as it intersects with existential psychotherapy, also finds a natural ally in Beckett's work. Mindfulness encourages the practitioner to observe thoughts, sensations, and emotions without judgment, embracing the emptiness that Beckett so starkly presents. In a 2020 workshop led by therapist Elaine Scarry, participants were guided through a reading of Beckett's Krapp's Last Tape, focusing on the protagonist's repeated listening to his own voice from the past. The facilitator asked participants to notice the silence between the recordings, prompting them to experience the gaps in their own narratives. The participants reported a heightened awareness of their internal waiting rooms, spaces where thoughts linger without resolution. This exercise demonstrates how Beckett's literary techniques can be directly applied to therapeutic settings, fostering a capacity to sit with uncertainty and to recognize that the nothingness is not a void to be filled, but a space that can hold meaning in its own right. In the realm of visual art, contemporary installations continue to draw on Beckettian motifs. The 2021 exhibition at the Tate Modern, titled Absence and Presence, featured a series of empty frames suspended in a dim gallery, each frame projected with a faint, looping audio of a single word: wait, listen, watch, repeating ad infinitum. Visitors were invited to walk among the frames, feeling the weight of the silence between the words. The curatorial statement explicitly referenced Beckett. Like the barren stage of Endgame, the gallery becomes a space where absence is made visible, where the audience is compelled to confront the limits of perception. This installation illustrates how Beckett's aesthetic continues to inspire artists who wish to explore the tension between what is shown and what is withheld, a tension that remains central to contemporary debates about representation, authenticity, and the politics of visibility. The cross-disciplinary resonance of Beckett's work also extends to legal theory. Legal scholars such as Martha Nussbaum have examined how literature can illuminate the moral imagination necessary for just lawmaking. In a recent article, Nussbaum cites Beckett's Waiting for Godot as an example of ethical imagination that forces readers to consider the plight of those who are perpetually waiting for justice that never arrives. By dramatizing the experience of waiting, Beckett provides a narrative framework that can be applied to the lived realities of marginalized groups, immigrants awaiting asylum decisions, prisoners on death row, or communities awaiting environmental remediation. The legal scholar argues that incorporating Beckettian narratives into jurisprudential education can cultivate empathy for the waiting subject, encouraging a more humane approach to policy that acknowledges the psychological toll of indefinite postponement. When we look at the broader cultural landscape, it becomes clear that Beckett's influence is not confined to isolated pockets, but is woven into the fabric of contemporary thought. The rise of slow media, a movement that advocates for deliberate, unhurried consumption of information, echoes Beckett's insistence on the value of pause. In a 2022 essay, media theorist Jussi Parikka writes, "In a world saturated with endless scroll, the Beckettian pause becomes an act of resistance, a way to reclaim the space where meaning can emerge from silence." This perspective aligns with the mindfulness practices discussed earlier, suggesting that the act of waiting can be a form of cultural critique, a way to slow down the relentless churn of information and to listen to the silence that Beckett so meticulously cultivated. To synthesize these diverse threads, we can articulate three central ways in which Beckett's philosophy remains vital today. First, Beckett provides a conceptual vocabulary for confronting the limits of certainty. Whether in AI, climate policy, or therapeutic settings, his emphasis on the nothingness that underlies all attempts at resolution equips us with a language to articulate uncertainty without surrendering to nihilism. Second, Beckett's aesthetic of minimalism and repetition offers a methodological template for artistic and activist practices that aim to foreground absence as a site of meaning. The performance art piece Waiting for the Tide and the Vladimir chatbot both employ Beckettian repetition to destabilize expectations and to create space for critical reflection. Third, Beckett's work functions as a bridge between existential concerns and post-humanist critiques, allowing us to interrogate how technology mediates our experience of time, agency, and embodiment. By juxtaposing Beckett's barren stage with Don Eich's mediated world, we can better understand the ethical stakes of a future in which the silent machine may become louder than the human voice. In closing, let us return to one of Beckett's most haunting lines from Endgame: "The end is always near, but it never arrives." This paradox, far from being a fatalistic surrender, invites us to inhabit the present moment with a heightened awareness of its transience. It reminds us that the waiting we experience, whether for a political breakthrough, for a technological solution, or for personal healing, is not a static void but a dynamic process that shapes who we become. As we navigate a world increasingly defined by rapid change, algorithmic mediation, and ecological crisis, Beckett's quiet, reflective voice offers a compass that points not toward an imagined future, but toward the richness of the present silence. By listening to that silence, by allowing the nothingness to speak, we may discover, as Beckett subtly suggests, that the very act of waiting can become a form of resistance, a space of creativity, and paradoxically, a source of meaning in a world that often seems bereft of it.